So I'll jump right in. I'm so pleased to greet everyone to today's virtual conference on the Holocaust at the Crossroads of Empire, West and Sub-Saharan African approaches to African, Holocaust, and Jewish studies. This is a program co-sponsored by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and our colleagues at the Leib Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. My name is Lisa Leff, and I'm the director of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, which is the academic department within the Holocaust Museum in Washington, DC. If you haven't encountered us before, let me just take a second to explain what we do. Our work within the museum is about supporting scholarship in Holocaust studies. To that end, we support conferences and workshops like today's. We host events at university campuses across North America. We host a leading journal in the field, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And we have a fellowship program that brings scholars from around the world to work in our archival collections for long periods of time. This is the first program we've sponsored about the history of the Holocaust and about Jewish studies in West Africa. But in fact, it has its origins in things we've done earlier. You see, many of the scholars on today's program have been fellows at the Mandel Center at one time or another. When these scholars came to us in Washington, however, they came individually to pursue individual research topics. And usually they found themselves to be the only fellows at the museum related to topics having to do with Africa. Mostly they were surrounded by other fellows working on the Holocaust in Europe. Now, these fellowships that they had were very productive from an individual point of view, but they did a lot more than that. They also pushed those other fellows working on the Holocaust in Europe to see their research in a very different light. So it was wonderfully productive for the whole community. And I would say we saw potential for it to do a lot for the field in general. The one thing that they did not get, however, was the opportunity to share their findings with one another, with people with whom their work so directly overlaps. So today is all about convening these scholars together to see what we learn when they come into conversation with one another. We're excited to see what Holocaust studies and Jewish studies tell us about colonial West Africa, and simultaneously, what colonial West African history tells us about the Holocaust. Thank you for being here. Let me turn it over to my colleague at UCLA, Sarah Stein.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm Sarah Abravaya Stein. I am a professor of history at UCLA, where I hold the Viterbi Family Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies, and also the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. And on behalf of the Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I am really delighted to add my words of welcome to this event. We are thrilled to be co-hosting this path-breaking workshop with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. It is the second such event that we have co-sponsored. The first, which was entitled On the Margins of the Holocaust, Jews, Muslims, and Colonialism in North Africa During the Second World War, took place in 2015 and resulted in a book that Omar Boum and I edited, entitled The Holocaust in North Africa, which was published by Stanford Press in cooperation with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So we are so thankful to our partners at that institution, and especially the visionary Krista Hegberg for their energy and their ingenuity and their collegiality. I also want to offer appreciation to the incredible staff of the Levy Center who are finessing this event and so many others this year with great professionalism and grace. Vivian Hollenbeck, Raina Chung, Chelsea White, Carolyn Luce, and David Wu. Thank you so much. Before I begin, I want to share with you that as a land grant institution, UCLA and the Levy Center wish to acknowledge the Gabrielino Togba peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, which is the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. The Levy Center at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. And the Levy Center at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Torongar, the Los Angeles Basin, and South Channel Islands. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. Today's event is landmark for various reasons, and I wish to identify two very quickly. First, it will allow us to expand our sense of the boundaries of Jewish studies and Holocaust studies by drawing attention to the complex cultural and political terrain of West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. These regions were not only home to Black African Jews, but were also sites on which Holocaust-era occupation, race laws, spoliation, and internment were carried out by the French Vichy regime, by the Nazi leadership in Germany, and by Italian fascist leadership. Now, these chapters of Jewish and Holocaust history have been largely neglected by scholars to date, with the exception of those represented here. And to the extent to which they have been explored, these histories have, I would argue, been unfairly, and perhaps in no small part due to anti-Black racist sentiment, been considered outside the so-called main story of Jewish and Holocaust history. We aim to begin to right this wrong today. Secondly, today's event gives pride of place to scholars in and from Morocco, Ghana, Mauritania, Senegal, Nigeria, and Mali, who have for too long been marginalized from academic conversations on Jewish studies and Holocaust studies, whether out of disinterest, disengagement, or prejudice. We have so much to learn from the erudite collection of scholars gathered here today, scholars who have committed themselves to unearthing Jewish and Holocaust era stories of the West and Sub-Saharan African past, to gathering archives on these topics, and to teaching their students and the larger scholarly and historically engaged public on these topics. We are thrilled to have you, our guests, on our virtual program today, and we hope that it marks the beginning of a conversation rather than its end. And with luck and persistence, we also hope to carry on this conversation in the region of West Africa with you very soon. So we thank all of our guests for their participation. We thank you who are Zooming in from across the world for joining us, and we look forward to learning together. On behalf of the Levy Center, I welcome our guests and all of you to the Holocaust and at the Crossroads of Empire. If you are Zooming in from home, please do use the Q&A feature at any time to share questions as the event proceeds, and our moderators and speakers will do their very best to address them. Now it is my great pleasure to turn the Zoom podium to my dear friend and colleague, Professor Omar Boum.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Omar Boum. I am Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles. I pray that you are safe and healthy, and that you are taking care of yourself and your loved ones in these unusual times. Welcome to UCLA L&D Levy Center for Jewish Studies. It is a real honor to be part of this global workshop with colleagues from West Africa, and in partnership with the Mandel Center at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Before I give my short note, I would like to thank Krista Hegberg, who gets a lot of credit for the idea of the program, and Lisa Leff for her support. My sincere thanks go to my colleague Sarah Stein for co-organizing and sponsoring the initiative, and to the staff of both centers, especially Chelsea, Noel, David, for all their logistical effort and labor. In 1865, Léon Philippe, a French meteorologist and with geological interest in North Africa, convinced the Alliance Israélite Universelle to use Mardochée Abis Soror, a Saharan Jew who lived in Timbuktu, to expand its knowledge about the Sub-Saharan and West African interior and their Jewish communities in particular. Born in the southern Moroccan oasis of Aqqa around 1830, Abi Soror exemplifies what I call the constant mobility of Jews in sub-Saharan and West African territories driven by economic opportunities. Although Abi Soror did not have a scientific background in data collection and interpretation, Léon Philippe maintained that the Geographic Society of Paris could benefit from using a native Jew to gather information on the Jewish communities of the Sahara. Philippe told Isidore Loeb, secretary of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, that Abi Soror had insider knowledge not only of the Sahara, but also of its dialects, including the Fulani and the Bambara. These skills would allow the Alliance Israélite Universelle to gather scientific and information and statistics about the Jews of West Africa. In 1880, Isidore Loeb translated Abi Soror's Judeo-Arabic account on the Dagatoun into French in what is known today as les Dagatoun, tribus d'origine juive demeurant dans le désert du Sahara. Loeb cautioned readers that Abi Soror was not trained in scientific methods, stating that while his account included some exaggerations and historical inaccuracies, it nonetheless could be treated as authoritative. The meaning of Dagatoun has long been subject to debate. According to Abi Soror, the name derived from the Tuareg designation for Jews who changed their beliefs. In the foreword to his translation of Abi Soror's report, Loeb stated that Dagatoun was a word that stood for merchant in Arabic. The Dagatoun lived mostly among the Tuareg and in the Adgag region. They were scattered between Adgag and Hogar. As protégés of the Tuareg, the Dagatoun were at their mercy and had to pay for protection. Equally important, Abi Soror traces the origins of West African Jewish communities to Tamantit and argues that their ancestors had fled the Tamantit region after Muhammad al-Maghili incited the local Muslims to expel them from the Tuat in 1492. Ironically, the same year Jews and Muslims were driven out of Spain in the aftermath of the Inquisition. Like most tribal desert groups, however, they lived in tents and were assimilated to the Tuareg culture and language, even though they spoke Arabic. Before the decline of the trans-Saharan trade and the occupation of Timbuktu in 1894, caravan routes linked sub-Saharan African towns to coast towns between Dakar and Essaouira via Tindouf. While the last major caravans were recorded in 1911, a few camel caravans continued to trade with the Saharan interior until 1945. These trading networks put Jews at the center of these marginal West African communities. While many historians have focused their attention on the Jewish communities of North African coastal and interior towns, and despite the long historical presence of Jews in the Saharan region, the history of African Jewries in general and Saharan as well as West African Jews in particular is one of the most understudied subjects in African historiographies today. By the second half of the 20th century, a new interest in the Jews of West Africa began to emerge, including among American and British journalists. This emerging global discourse on the so-called exotic and long forgotten Jews of Africa is today at the center of internet blogosphere. A number of internet sites have given ample attention to what are called lost and dispersed remnants of the Jewish people of Africa. These websites list these communities and provide personal accounts about their claims of Jewish identity. The internet has added a dimension of Western nostalgia and exoticism in these virtual debates of Jewish past and history in the African interior. Putting exoticization aside, we should note references to Saharan Jews in academic works recent as Goitein, Sarah Stein, and myself, and ancient as Al-Bakri. The early conversations about the Jewish communities of Sub-Saharan and West African featured in the classical works of As-Sa'di, Ibn Khaldun, Al-Bakri, Leo Africanus, and others. Colonial and post-colonial scholars such as John Hanwick, Raymond Money, Theodore Monod, Vincent Montal, Oliel Jacob, Tudor Parfit, Michel Abitbol, and Edith Bruder looked at the phenomena of Jewish presence in West and Sub-Saharan Africa, sometimes without challenging colonial biases of historical narratives and historiographical representation, such as the works of Joseph William and Karen Primack. In past and present debates, and despite the plethora of local written and oral archives in the family libraries of Djenné, Timbuktu, Shingidi, and other Western African public and private archives, West African Judaism continues to be a marginal topic in Jewish studies, despite a few cases, and West African University remains excluded from Jewish discussions in Western academia, with a few exceptions. Until a few years ago, similar fate was encountered by West African scholars who worked on Vichy policy in French West Africa. From June 1940 to January 1943, the Vichy government was in charge of the French West African territories, and the Vichy Governor General Pierre Boisson directed all internment camps. These camps were established to hold Allied prisoners of war, and included the camps of Koulikoro, Timbuktu, Kankan, Kindia, and others in Mali, Senegal, and Guinea. While the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has included in its programming the scholarship of Alion Dem, Sidi Ndai, and Chigbo Aniaduba between 2013 and 2019, more academic support and inclusion of local West African scholars in scholarship on World War II needs to be included to this list, and more research on document of Senegalese tirailleurs, including Léopold Sédar Senghor, should be encouraged and supported. At the level of documentation, a comprehensive archival listing available to African scholars about World War II is an urgent matter. An oral history of the role of Senegalese tirailleurs in World War II is an emergency. In terms of Jewish archives, collections, families throughout West Africa, including the Haidaras, should be recognized and acknowledged for the conservation works they have done throughout the years as they fought through their own means to protect documents that go back to the 15th century from heat, termites, and human destruction. Yet despite all the challenges, today is a moment of celebration. Today's speakers exemplify a growing trend within West African history that attempt at challenging the colonial regionalism that separate West African Jewish studies from North Africa and beyond, using comparative studies within the fields of African studies, German studies, history, literary studies, and other fields to open up spaces to study African genocide through Holocaust studies. With this context in mind, it is my honor and privilege to introduce my colleague, Michael Rothberg, who will chair the first panel, Black African Jewish Histories. Dr. Rothberg is the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in Holocaust Studies and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is the author of The Implicated Subject Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, Multi-Directional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, and Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation. With Yasmin Yildiz, he is currently completing Memory, Citizenship, Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance for Fordham University Press. Michael, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Omar. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to the first session of today's conference on Black African Jewish history. It's absolutely an honor and a really exciting moment for me to be part of this path-breaking conference, which I think is also part of an important movement within Holocaust studies and Jewish studies to adopt more global perspectives. So I'm so glad to be here. Our time is relatively short, so I'm going to go right into it. I want to mention that all of the biographies of the speakers today are also available on the Levy Center's website. And I want to remind you that you should pose questions using the Q&A function, and you're welcome to do that as we go along, and we'll come back to them after our four speakers have spoken. So let me introduce our speakers for the first panel. Our first speaker will be Ismael Diadie Haidara, who is a historian, philosopher, and poet who lives in Spain. He's currently the president of the Kati Foundation in Spain and directory of the Kati Fund in Mali, the most important Andalusian documentary legacy outside of Spain. Ismael, who went into exile in Spain from Mali after the Tuareg rebellion of 2002, is the last descendant of Ali Ben Ziab al-Kuti, a citizen of Toledo, expelled in 1467 and installed in Timbuktu. Is the author of several books, most recently in Spanish, From Toledo to Timbuktu, A Road Made of Manuscripts, with Antonio Llaguno Rojas. And he has lectured in France, Spain, Switzerland, Morocco, Mexico, Italy, Senegal, and other countries about the documentary legacy and history, poetry, and medieval sciences. His talk today will be called A Brief Overview of the Written Sources of the Boucle du Niger, relating to the Jewish presence in Timbuktu from the 15th to the 19th century. He's going to be speaking in French, but there will be an English language PowerPoint presentation as well. But let me first introduce the rest of the speakers. The second speaker will be Janice Levi, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research focuses on the history of Jewish presence in West Africa. She completed her undergraduate degree in history at the University of Oklahoma and received a Master's of Arts in History at UCLA and African Studies at Indiana University. Her talk will be called I Am Known by My Clothing, Jewish Refugee Ship and Community in 20th Century Ghana. Our third speaker will be Edward Kissy, who's an associate professor at the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies at the University of South Florida in Tampa, and a member of the Africana Studies faculty there as well. He's a native of Ghana, has studied in Canada, and was an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow in genocide studies at Yale University. Edward's research focuses on the history of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, US foreign relations with Africa since the 20th century, and the comparative history of genocide and human rights. He's the author of Revolution and Genocide in Ethiopia and Cambodia, and a number of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on genocide, famine, international relief, and US policy toward Africa in the Cold War period. His latest book, Africans and the Holocaust, Perceptions and Responses of Colonized and Sovereign Peoples from 2020, is a pioneering effort to integrate sub-Saharan African perspectives into Holocaust studies and incorporate Holocaust content into African history. His talk today will be called West Africa and the Crossroads of the Holocaust and Holocaust Studies. And our fourth and final speaker for this morning's panel is Maguette Kassé, who is a professor in intercultural studies at Sheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Senegal. He's an art critic and the former general curator of the Biennial of Contemporary African Arts, DACART. A specialist of jazz in the negritude and the African origins of jazz, he was awarded a 2012 Fulbright Scholarship to study the representation of Africans and African Americans in Germany at Howard University. He's written and lectured about the representation of African literature in Germany and the literary and cinematographic work of Sembène Ousmane, the great African filmmaker. His talk today is called Africans, Americans of African Descent and Jews, Contemporaneity in a Society of Exclusion and the Construction of Destiny's Fatality. So right with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ismael, who once again will be speaking in French, but with a PowerPoint presentation in English. Remember, you can pose your questions in the Q&A as we go along. Thanks. Ismael, it's all yours.
Merci, chers collègues et auditeurs, pour me donner la parole à propos des Juifs, parole qui m'a été refusée depuis des années, depuis la publication de mon livre sur les Juifs à Tombouctou. Raison pour laquelle je vous remercie de façon expresse à propos donc de cette rencontre. Je vais commencer par faire observer que l'histoire des Juifs en Afrique noire est le parent pauvre des études juives et des études africaines, et de façon particulière, celles qui rendent compte de la présence juive en Afrique noire. Depuis les travaux de Hirschberg jusqu'à Bitbol, nous avons des études bien faites et bien coordonnées, mais il nous faut avancer. Et je crois que cette rencontre nous permettra de faire un pas de plus. Ceci dit, il faut faire observer que Tombouctou, qui est une des villes universitaires reconnues au niveau international, a eu sa première présence dans la cartographie du XIVe siècle à travers un juif qui est Abraham Kresk et Fouda. Et depuis, les Juifs n'ont pas arrêté d'avoir une présence active à Tombouctou et dans la boucle du Niger. Si on essaie de voir les sources juives et les sources écrites relatives à l'Afrique, à la présence juive en Afrique, on peut dire qu'il y a trois types de sources. Il y a les sources historiques, donc des livres d'histoire écrits sur les Juifs dans la boucle du Niger, tels le Tarikh al-Fattash de la famille Mahmoud Kati, le Nail Ibtihaj d'Ahmed Baba, le Tariq al-Soudan de Abdurrahman al-Sadi. Nous avons des lettres ensuite et finalement des documents notariés. Avec donc ces actes, ces documents, ces trois formes de documents que nous avons, nous pouvons dire que la première forme, les formes historiques, nous en reparlerons vers la conclusion. Ce sont des documents qui relatent la présence juive à Tombouctou à une période ou à une autre, ou qui font référence de passage à cette présence. Les actes notariés que nous avons sont des documents établis par des notaires, par des juges, des Kadi, qui ont servi de pont entre les commerçants juifs qui sont venus ou de la zone de Mogador ou du Tazir Waled du sud marocain pour faire commerce à Tombouctou. Et ce sont des documents que nous avons qui commencent à partir de la fin de la première moitié du 19e siècle et qui vont se poursuivre jusqu'à la pénétration française pratiquement. À partir de la pénétration française 1893-1894, les choses changent. Ce sont donc des rapports coloniaux qui vont commencer à faire parler la présence juive à Tombouctou. Les actes notariés sont établis donc par différents notaires, et ces notaires sont, je l'ai dit, des juges, et à travers ces actes, nous voyons la présence de juifs du Maroc spécifiquement, de façon sporadique des juifs algériens ou qui viennent de la Libye, donc des juifs d'Afrique du Nord qui descendent vers Tombouctou. À partir du XVIIIe siècle, nous avons de Fès les Cohen qui forment une communauté à Tombouctou. Oscar Lanz dit qu'on les confond pratiquement avec le reste de la population parce que ce sont des juifs convertis. Mais nous trouvons des juifs qui pratiquent le judaïsme avec une synagogue qu'à partir de la présence de Mardoché Abisserour, qui s'installe à Tombouctou à partir de 1860 à peu près. Et avec lui s'installe donc, on passe à un autre niveau, avec lui s'installent les juifs de Mogador et de Tazir Waled à Tombouctou. Avec cette installation, on peut passer à un autre niveau. On continue, ça c'est un acte notarié de ces juifs. Ici, on peut voir que les Juifs qui s'installent à partir de 1860 à Tombouctou sont en grande partie de la famille du rabbin Mardoché Abisserour, Mordechai Abisror. Et ce n'est pas la peine de rentrer dans cette liste. On peut voir que nous avons beaucoup plus de 10 Juifs présents et qui font du commerce. Et donc, avec ces Juifs, ils étaient déjà autorisés à se constituer comme communauté et avoir une synagogue. Ils sont autorisés par les ulamas, par les intellectuels, par les autorités de Tombouctou à ouvrir une synagogue à Tombouctou au 19e siècle, à faire leurs prières, à faire leur commerce. C'est ce qui montre donc ces différents notaires autorisés à faire leurs actes. Donc, quand on essaie de voir le panorama général des listes de notaires qui se donnent, on voit bien que ce sont des notaires attitrés, reconnus dans toute la boucle du Niger, qui font ces actes, donc qui reconnaissent tacitement la présence des Juifs à Tombouctou, une présence très active. Nous avons des centaines de documents établis par ces notaires et principalement à partir de Mardoché Abisserour jusqu'à Eliyahu el-Yahoudi, qui fut le commerçant le plus actif et qui a le plus de documents dans nos bibliothèques. Ici, nous avons dans cette photo l'image du Kadi, Ahmed Baba, qui est au milieu, qui est celui qui a le plus établi d'actes notariés pour les Juifs à Tombouctou. Ici, nous avons un exemple de lettres, de documents, et en fait, nous avons énormément de lettres écrites à partir de Fès, de Mogador ou du sud marocain par des commerçants marocains qui utilisent les services des Juifs. Ces Juifs utilisent les services des transporteurs Touaregs qui font le lien entre les dernières villes du Maroc avec Arawan et finalement Tombouctou. Et ces lettres circulent en donnant le prix des marchandises, les besoins des commerçants à Tombouctou, les prix des marchandises et leur valeur en général au Maroc, en Espagne, dans le sud français, à Marseille et jusqu'à Venise. Les lettres circulaient entre Venise, la France, l'Espagne, le Maroc et Tombouctou. À partir de ces éléments qu'on a donnés, nous pouvons voir à travers les lettres, les actes notariés et les textes historiques de Mahmoud Kati, Ahmed Baba, Abderrahman Saadi et un des grands savants du XVe siècle, qui est le Marili. Si on essaie de faire une lecture rapide, comme le temps nous l'exige, sur la présence juive et les considérations faites par ces savants, nous nous rendrons compte qu'il y a un discours qui a évolué du XVe au XIXe siècle. Dans les premières sources du XVe siècle, influencées par le Marili, on trouve que les Juifs sont pratiquement considérés comme des non-croyants, auxquels ils refusent le droit de protection que l'islam donne juridiquement aux chrétiens, aux juifs. À partir d'Al-Marili, le discours évolue avec Ahmed Baba, qui a été, durant des années, après la conquête saadienne du Songhai en 1591, prisonnier à Marrakech, au temps d'Al-Mansour al-Bahbi. On voit Ahmed Baba considérer les Juifs comme des hommes qui sont pratiquement corvéables, ce qui est pratiquement une agression aux lois islamiques de l'époque comme d'aujourd'hui. Et quand on arrive au XIXe siècle, on voit comment le discours a évolué et a changé. Et ce discours n'est plus seulement un discours qui constitue la figure du juif comme une marginalité juridiquement exclue, avec Al-Marili et Ahmed Baba, mais cette figure est réintégrée, mais comme une altérité justifiée par la loi islamique. Donc, le juif est désormais considéré comme un dhimmi, un sujet qui doit payer une sorte de taxe qui fera son acceptation sociale, qui lui permettra de vivre dans la communauté musulmane, de faire commerce dans la communauté musulmane, mais de rester comme un sujet différent de la marginalité. Et donc, on voit l'évolution, la courbe évolutive de la présence juive, considérée du temps des Askia avec El-Marili jusqu'au temps du royaume Peul du Massina avec la présence de Mordechai à Bisrour. On voit comment les savants musulmans ont évolué de la marginalité à l'altérité et d'une certaine altérité à l'exclusion. Parce qu'à partir de la pénétration coloniale, les Juifs vont cesser d'exister à Tombouctou. C'est l'époque pré-Vichy, si on ose dire, avec la conquête coloniale française, où le Juif, le dernier Juif qui est resté à Tombouctou, est arrêté, emprisonné, et c'est la fin de l'histoire des Juifs. Et c'est la fin aussi des sources arabes relatives aux Juifs, qui va donner la place aux sources françaises qui sont des rapports d'information. Je vous remercie.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ismael, for that opening talk. And I'm going to, as soon as we make the transition here, I'm going to turn things over to Janice Levi and her talk, I Am Known by My Clothing, Jewish Refugee Ship and Community in 20th Century Ghana. So Janice, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And merci, Ismael. Votre travail est très important dans mes recherches. Merci. So thank you, Michael, and for the organizers for inviting me to this panel that brings together two fields that I focus in, which is African studies and Jewish studies. And as Sarah and Lisa both indicated, these are fields that have not traditionally worked together, but over the last decade certainly are becoming more collaborative. I'm going to see if I can share my PowerPoint. I didn't do that. Hopefully everyone can see it. Let's see here. All right, so I don't want to dismiss the work of Jewish studies within North Africa, but I think it's important to acknowledge, and I think which Ismael just and Omar kind of demystified, is this sense of the Sahara as a barrier. And by thinking of the Sahara as a barrier from North Africa to the rest of continental Africa, it creates this geographical but also epistemological divide. And I want to avoid studying the Holocaust history as a novelty, being the marker for Jewish movement into continental Africa south of the Sahara, but to recognize that these area studies divisions have perpetuated a degree of epistemic violence by creating this blind spot of the porousness of the Sahara that has facilitated movement of cultures and peoples and goods for over a millennium, as again, Ismael and Omar pointed to. If there is time, I'll be able to discuss how these histories serve as a historical precedent for Black African communities identifying as Jewish now in West Africa. But for the 15 minutes I've been allotted today for this presentation, I do want to think about how these two fields historically intersect, keeping in mind the organizing title of this workshop, that is Holocaust at the Crossroads of Empire. And I hope to tease out two themes. One is the history of violence, lending itself to the mobility and specifically refugeeship, violence tethered to methods of empire and racial science, specifically anti-Semitic ideology, which again is not new to the Holocaust or Western empires, but certainly exacerbated by it. And second is the history of commerce facilitated by crossroads of empire and international byways and highways or seaways through the desert and along the coast. In the 20th century, we see racial violence that leads up to the Holocaust, it being part and parcel of Nazi ideology by the 1940s, and it being a catalyst for Jewish mobility as refugees out of Central Europe and into, for example, West Africa, and specifically what I look at, the Gold Coast of Ghana, but also the industrial era amps up movement, hyped up by the needs of the Industrial Revolution and war that brings about international commerce and expats working in colonial lands, including Jewish persons working on behalf of imperial and or commercial enterprises. I have a map that mirrors what Omar has showed earlier. When thinking of the Holocaust and its intersections within a colonized Africa, I would highlight the influence of racial science in these spaces. And I actually think that this is an intersection that proves most interesting, as it's not just happening in Nazi Germany, but it's also made visible by looking at colonized Africa, not just French or German or Italian, but also British governance. It is important to note that at this time, Jews are certainly not considered Aryan, as we know, but not even white, which I think that our 21st century relation sometimes tethers them to. An identity of whiteness is further being concretized during the Third Reich, and this also privileges and identifies as superior white Western races that are at the time colonizing much of the non-white world. As Black studies have detailed, these tropes and characterizations of non-white populations also tended to produce propaganda and ideologies of criminality and animalistic behaviors, with parallels between Jewish and Black African depictions. Here you see two pieces of propaganda art that poses both Jewish men and African men, similarly with that being a threat to Aryan women. Those who are not strangers to World War II propaganda generated by the Third Reich will be familiar with these images showcasing Jews as not just other, but a dangerous other, one that is menacing, that is possibly making corrupt or inferior one's race via intermarriage, which leads to this push for racial cleansing. So at this time, Jews, again, are not linked at all to whiteness. Karen Brodkin, of course, recognizes this in her book, How Jews Became White in America, acknowledging the history of the racial needle moving over time closer to whiteness for Jews. Shalva Weil talks about racial gradations in Israel with the inclusion of Mizrahi and Ethiopian Jews, where at one time Mizrahi are seen as the Black Jews of Israel, but when the Beta Israel of Ethiopia come in, they are now the marker for Blackness. But then you have, in the case of South Africa, where Jews are not becoming more white based on context of racial comparative to indigenous populations such as the Zulu or Xhosa, but rather are begrudgingly situated in the highest of the racial class of whiteness simply due to their access to capital. This mirrors the British relation to Jews often in history, with Jews seen as a possible economic benefit and not a community to be included in the white or top class, if you will. So for a quick recap of British history, in 1066, you have Jews expelled by William the Conqueror. They're not brought back in until 1656 by Oliver Cromwell, who is hoping to utilize their trade networks to help essentially broke England at the time. The community is very against this because they have these tropes of Jews as menacing, as murderous, who will kill Christians, steal their blood, steal their commerce. And we have many letters from the public and to Whitehall articulating this dismay and disapproval of inviting Jews back in. So from 1656 into the 20th century, there is a very anti-Semitic atmosphere and attitude among the British populace. And we also have to note that South Africa was a British colony, and white supremacist and racial ideas are not introduced by white Afrikaners in apartheid, but rather a continuation of British systems of governance that already had racial discrimination part of their governance. So in 1910 to 1948, South Africa was an independent commonwealth, and they fought with the Allies in World War II. But in 1948, when they become independent, they want to continue on the racial discrimination of British colonial governance. And the Boers and Afrikaners are more sympathetic to Germans, with the majority of Afrikaner and Boer political parties both ascribing to Nazi and neo-Nazi ideology. And so when they codify Jews as white, it's not due to racial camaraderie, as again, Jews are not seen as white in South Africa, but it is economically negotiated as the new state of Israel established the same year as apartheid is showing great economic promise, and South Africa strikes a deal with the Jewish community to take a large percentage of the import profits. So yet again, Jews are not seen as white. And what this means is that when we look at Jews in colonial spaces where racial systems are operating both formally and informally, then we have to acknowledge that the violence of empire often perpetuates racial hatred. But it also means that colonial systems are operating under this racial system, which thereby creates barriers for Jewish persons that may not mirror local sentiment of indigenous populations who do not subscribe to racial science, as we'll see in the Gold Coast. So by studying the Holocaust at the crossroads of empire, we can observe how these racial systems exist in empire and influence imperial decisions when the Jewish question is posed due to the movement of refugees from Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And so how empire responds to Holocaust makes visible the reach of racial science across the imperial world. So by the 20th century, being Jewish in West Africa was still not to be paraded by the British Empire. Although service to the British Empire was highly regarded in Jewish circles. In 1900, here's just a picture of the Gold Coast colony. In 1900, Matthew Nathan, who had been serving as governor of Sierra Leone, was appointed governor of the Gold Coast of Ghana. He served there for 3 years. And according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, Nathan was, quote, the first appointment of a Jew to a distant English colonial governorship. Within a month of his appointment, he had ended a 6-month ongoing war, one of the most well-known for resisting British governance, of the Ya Asante War. And he showed mercy to these anti-British Ashanti soldiers by not executing them as had been advised. Graham Dominy, a researcher at the University of South Africa and former National Archivist of South Africa, who has biographed Matthew Nathan, noted how Nathan dealt with anti-Semitic sentiments throughout his colonial tenure, with his decisions being undermined and his experience challenged. When posted to Ireland, he was accused of being a Mason and a Jew, 2 identities that for centuries were deprecatory. Nathan's assumed identity as an English gentleman is what allowed him mobility within the colonial enterprise, and his Jewish background was actually the barrier that would have labeled him as an outsider to that British caste. And Nathan was mindful of these challenges and the challenges that his Jewish identity posed. So by the first half of the 20th century, Judaism within the British Empire is still a pariah, not only in the metropole, but also in the colonies. And this ultimately shapes the British Gold Coast and their decision about World War II Jewish refugees. So by the 1930s, Jews are still persona non grata. And while we see the reach of anti-Semitism in Vichy, France by Omar Boum and Sarah Stein's work, anti-Semitic policies and harassment continued to ramp up also in mainland Europe and Britain. And the world stood by. Many nations not acting upon concern about ideological differences regarding Aryanism that made victim of European Jewry and others, yet it was the response to Hitler's uncouth advance of territory with the invasion of Poland in 1939 being the last straw before Britain and France declared war. And it is this that shapes the British response concern for Nazi refugees, or British response to refugees, which is the concern that Nazis are extending their territory and not out of concern for Jewish refugees themselves. So now we can zero in to West Africa, which is perhaps seen as worlds away from the atrocities on the European front, but was not excluded from the Jewish gaze when seeking an escape. Letters from Jewish men to the colonial authorities in the British Gold Coast pleaded for a safe haven. Most were denied as the Gold Coast colony felt they could not trust refugees to be friendly and not actually enemy aliens who may don a refugee identity to slip in the borders and then attempt to gain territory for the Nazi regime. Colonial territories were requested to follow the same protocol as that in the UK regarding enemy aliens, or those perceived to be, which included internment until their identities and circumstances, including being able to self-finance, were better understood. Throughout the colonies, the Jewish question was articulated as the question of the settlement of refugees, and most Western nations did not want an increased Jewish refugee population. Vouching for one's reputation was often facilitated through an ad placed in the African Morning Post or another local newspaper, where citizens or other colonialists were invited to write in should they be able to contest why individuals should not remain and or be naturalized. Heinrich Bein, a German Jewish refugee who worked in the United African Company Limited, was approved on his second application, having already worked in the Gold Coast for 27 months. He later sought refuge in the UK and South Africa due to failing health, but was denied as Jewish mobility was just not accessible. Some Jews, for instance, 35-year-old Hans Karl Loeb, who had escaped Buchenwald, was able to slip into the Gold Coast in May 1939 by joining his brother, who was already working north of Accra for Bartholomew and Company. Hans was able to gain work, but not for long. Due to the outbreak of the war, the colonial state interned both him and his brother, Walter, in Kumasi. For the Loeb brothers, internment resulted in the loss of their jobs. With that, the colonial state feared having to support financially the refugees and began passing paperwork to immigrate them elsewhere. So here we see the violence of empire operating with internment cutting off their ability to self-support, which was a condition of being able to remain or be naturalized. Others, such as Ernest Weiss, a trilingual shoemaker from the Nazi protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, requested entry but was denied. The colonial secretary responded within 2 weeks of receiving his plea, stating, quote, "No person other than a native of West Africa is allowed to enter the colony unless he can show to the satisfaction of the immigration officer either that he is in possession of substantial funds or that he can obtain a guarantee from a prospective employer. As it appears that you will not be able, advise you that it is not desirable that you should make preparations to settle in the Gold Coast," end quote. Interestingly, amidst the debate between colonial governance and statesmen back in the UK, the Omanhini, or a local Akan ruler of a Akan region or larger town, considered providing shelter for European Jews by allotting a portion of land for refuge. In a report from the Central Province on May 1st, 1939, the plan is detailed by the commissioner of the Central Province, AFE Fieldgate. Fieldgate reported, quote, "The Omanhini had discussed the question of Jewish immigration with other chiefs and that they were prepared to offer land for settlement. But the British administration struck down the idea, stating, the Omanhini should be informed that while His Excellency greatly appreciates his motive in offering land for occupation by Jewish refugees, a settlement scheme such as that which the Omanhini seems to envisage would be wholly impracticable." This reveals a lack of desire for the colonial empire to make space for non-white populations that are not, quote, native of West Africa or a citizen of the British Empire. Yet the same fear of Jews not being legitimately Jewish, and thus perhaps Nazi spies, is not articulated in the many German workers entering the Gold Coast. For example, they tally up the amount of refugees entering the colonial empire and the Gold Coast over a 5-year period. And they calculate 675 Germans, Austrians, and Czechoslovakians have entered. They were there mostly to engage in commerce and being missionaries, and were quickly labeled as anti-Nazi. And 3 families could be identified as refugees, but Jewish refugee seeking went under quite a more strenuous review. So these discussions about the Holocaust at the crossroads of empire, it is important for us to understand the underlying cause of these interactions and relations is certainly this growing commitment and belief in racial science that has othered Jewish persons. So while there are allies fighting World War II for protection of empire, they are also concerned about these racial systems where making space for Jewish refugees is not made possible, and specifically adult refugees, which again are seen as criminal. Of course, there's the kinder transport program that welcomes children, but again, children who have financial backing. So in these allied or imperial spaces, they're flirting with and instituting racial science formally and informally, and are concerned and skeptical of Jewish bodies, immediately criminalized as possibly Nazi spies, which is hypocritical again with German citizens being welcomed, and even former Nazis find refuge in government work in many allied nations and imperial spaces. So to conclude is to say that while I don't have time to discuss the House of Israel, a Black Jewish community in Ghana, what I can highlight is that while the Holocaust lays bare that West Africa or continental Africa is historically a space of refuge and a space of possible commerce and commercial prosperity, as we saw with Bein and Loeb, this is not new to Africa. It's a continent connected by the Sahara, not divided by it. Africa all of Africa, inclusive of the Sahara and beyond, has been a space of refuge from empire, both Almoravid and Almohad Islamic persecutions from the 11th centuries and into the medieval era. And it has been a space of commercial opportunity and trade in the medieval era and colonial period, along the coast and through the interior. The Holocaust serves as an access point to shed light on Africa, not as a foreign, distant, imaginary, inaccessible land, but a place for Jewish survival, physical and economic, accessible by land, sea, and ultimately by air, but more often than not upon permission of or concealment from empire. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Janice, for that talk. And I want to turn things over to Edward Kissy, whose talk is entitled, once again, West Africa and the Crossroads of the Holocaust and Holocaust Studies. So Edward, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And thank you very much to the organizers of this very important conference. And thank you also to everyone who took time to join us this morning. I think the preceding presentations have offered me some very important context for the presentation of my own paper on West Africa and the crossroads of the Holocaust and Holocaust studies. There are two affirmative points that I want to make and then underscore their inherent irony. Yes, as Omar Boum and Ismael Haidara discussed earlier, there is a rich history of Jews and Judaism in West Africa that goes back to the 13th century through to the end of the 19th and even into the 20th. And yes, as Janice Levy just shared with us, there are groups in West Africa, especially in Ghana and in Nigeria, who claim Jewish identity. But here is the irony. The historical and contemporary presence of Jews in West Africa have not led to any significant interest in Jewish studies or even Holocaust studies in West Africa's private and public school curricula. The exception appears to be Senegal at Cheikh Anta Diop University. This silence is deeply ironic because in the 1930s and 1940s, major newspapers in West Africa, edited by educated Africans, followed events in Europe and reported vigorously on Nazism and the Holocaust. The West African Pilot and the Comet in the British colony of Nigeria, the Gold Coast Independent, the Ashanti Pioneer, the Gold Coast Spectator, and the African Morning Post in the British colony of the Gold Coast, the Daily Guardian in the British colony of Sierra Leone, and the African Nationalist in the independent nation of Liberia brought the plight of Jews in Europe and their persecution at the hands of Nazi Germany to their readers and other people in West Africa. But here is the question. Why were they interested in the Holocaust and Jewish life then? And why are they disinterested now? Two reasons sparked their interest in the Holocaust in the 1930s and 1940s. The Nazi destruction of European Jews, a group of people that the West African Post in 1938 described as having contributed the greatest to Western civilization, raised questions about European colonialism in Africa, which had been justified by advocates of empire as a civilizing mission. The Holocaust provided the most concrete evidence of European barbarism, and educated Africans and ordinary readers of newspapers used that to challenge the civilizing mission claim and also contest the promise of Western civilization as a moral substitute to African cultural values in the colonial encounter. Thus, press reports on the plight of Jews in Europe became a useful discursive tool for opposing European colonial rule in West Africa. 2, interest in the Holocaust in West Africa, particularly in the press, also served as a military enlistment tool, a means of recruiting large numbers of people in West Africa to join the colonial army for service in World War II, not necessarily to fight for Britain, but to preserve African life and dignity. My late great-great-grand-uncle fought in that war. I think the British owe me some money that I will soon be requesting. Between May and June 1940, when Germany invaded and defeated France, the West African press anticipated a possible German victory in the war, and therefore the expectation that a post-war world controlled by Nazi Germany might pose the greatest existential threat to educated Africans in the face of the overwhelming evidence of the destruction of educated white Jews of European descent by white Germans. West Africa's educated elite saw and reported on the Holocaust as a forewarning of what the Nazi regime could do to Black Africans if Germany became victorious in World War II. But here is something very interesting that we tend to overlook in African studies and Holocaust studies. What is also evident in newspaper reports at this particular moment in time, 1930s and 1940s, is that it was also the era when some people in West Africa began to name their newborn children after Adolf Hitler. And this is not particular to West Africa. It was happening in Central Africa and Southern Africa too. Now, this must not be interpreted as an anti-Jewish, pro-Holocaust sentiment. It must be seen as an anti-British and anti-French proclivity. Ironically, the interest that people in West Africa showed in Jewish life in Europe and in the Holocaust between 1933 and 1945 disappeared after the Second World War ended and the decade of independence from British and French colonial rule began in the 1950s and 1960s. 3 reasons account for this disengagement from Jewish studies and the Holocaust at the crossroads of empire in West Africa. 1, the politics of the Middle East. 2, pedagogy in state-funded or government-assisted education. And 3, interest in a new African historiography. Let me discuss these 3 reasons and then offer some concluding thoughts on my presentation. The first, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 had been welcomed enthusiastically by English-speaking West Africans. But the founding of the new State of Israel also coincided with the official declaration of apartheid by the National Party in South Africa in 1948, which the English press in West Africa denounced. This convergence of enthusiasm and despair was further complicated by the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949 and the onset of the Cold War. Reports in the West African press that NATO had secret plans to defend Israel and South Africa in the event of an outbreak of a Third World War, laid the foundation for the pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian, and anti-Israel orientation of the Organization of African Unity in the 1960s. The Arab-Israeli Six-Day War of 1967 inflamed the crystallizing suspicion in West Africa of a pro-Israel and pro-South Africa orientation of NATO and the Western Bloc countries. This suspicion and the Israeli victory in the Six-Day War led many of the post-colonial African nation states to break diplomatic relations with Israel in solidarity with the Arab world and the PLO. Under these circumstances, any interest in Jewish studies or the Holocaust in national educational policy in West Africa became political taboo. Second, even beyond international politics, educational pedagogy, especially curricular development, undermined interest in Holocaust studies in West Africa. Political independence meant a shift from missionary school education and its pro-Jewish content and the establishment of state-funded public school education and their interest in a new African citizenship. That shift began to define the focus of national educational policy. Post-colonial public education was now geared towards the production of teaching materials and the establishment of teacher training colleges to promote a new type of patriotism. National educational curricula did not leave room for teaching materials on the Holocaust and the history of Jews. Pedagogy was directed towards the translation of books into local languages and the teaching of national and continental history. Holocaust studies became a casualty of post-colonial national educational policy. 3, this new pedagogy was also the outcome of the quest for a new decolonized African historiography that began in the 1960s. New public schools and new universities and the return of control of colonial university colleges to Africans in the new nation states inspired a new interest in the academic study of Africa that aimed at fostering a new Pan-African nationalism, a new negritude. The focus was on eradicating all Eurocentric features of African historiography, especially the imperial idea in the late colonial period that the history of Africa is the history of the European experience in Africa. The post-colonial African historiography was about disengagement from Europe and the placement of Africa at the center of African studies. Holocaust studies represented an entanglement with what took place in Europe, and it threatened to overshadow the new focus on Africa. The post-colonial approach to African studies was part of the nation-state building project, as much as it was an anti-European and decolonizing scholarship. It is in this context that we must understand the movement from enthusiasm in Jewish life and Holocaust studies in the 1930s and 1940s to a decline of interest in Holocaust and Jewish studies in the post-colonial period. And let me conclude by saying that, unfortunately, much of the world has left West Africa, including my own country, Ghana, behind when it comes to Holocaust and Jewish studies or appreciating the history of the Holocaust. Now, there is a painful irony in what has happened in West Africa that I have already underscored. And not only West Africa, much of Sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of Senegal and then South Africa. Today, African studies needs another focus: integration of Holocaust studies and the study of Jewish life in West Africa into the academic study of Africa. A few scholars, some of them of African descent, have begun to integrate the Holocaust impact in North Africa and other parts of Africa into the interdisciplinary study of the Holocaust in order to bridge the gap between Holocaust studies and African studies. Robert Satlov's Among the Righteous: Lost Stories from the Holocaust Long Reach into Arab Lands, 2006. W. William F.S. Miles's Jews of Nigeria: An Afro-Judaic Odyssey, 2013. Sarah Steins and Omar Boom's The Holocaust and North Africa, 2019. And my book, Africans and the Holocaust, 2020, among a few, have begun that necessary historiographical process. This conference is a part of that process, and the organizers of it must be commended highly. But more needs to be done. But I must advise that any future effort at making Jewish studies and Holocaust studies companion components of African historiography must take into account the politics of the Middle East, the focus of national educational policy, and the role of Africanists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Edward, for that talk. And I want to move directly to our fourth talk by Magué Kassé, and then remind you that after that, we'll be able to discuss all four of these lectures. So please continue to enter your questions into the Q&A. Magué's talk is Americans of African Descent and Jews: Contemporaneity in a Society of Exclusion and the Construction of Destiny's Fatality. Magué, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. At the very start, I would like to say that I welcome the opportunity to speak on a topic that has been and still is occupying me in my recent research and teaching on Germany and Africa through the history of their relationship. This research is not that of a historian, but a Germanist interested in contemporary German language and civilization, who teaches this discipline under the name of intercultural German studies. Many people in Germany wonder often why Africans are interested in German language and culture. What can tell us more about German society from the Middle Ages up to the fascist and contemporary era than its literary, colonial novel, propaganda film, philosophical, Hegel and Kant are the most outstanding, ethnographic, Eugen Fischer and eugenics, anthropological, pseudo-scientific research and consideration on African art to construct a discourse of exclusion, of rejection shaped on the German collective unconsciousness, a discourse built on cliches, stereotypes. In this respect, the literary and human sciences are a precious reservoir of knowledge and experience. It seemed relevant to talk about our research on the subjects that interest us today, about the presence of what in Germany was commonly called the black man because of the color of his skin, about the encounters in the popular imagination, and in an elaborated discourse with this being, about the rejection of which he is the object and the exploitation he has suffered in German colonial history, of the history of Nazism, of the dream of colonial reconquest, of the Third Reich, of the deportation of Africans or forced labor, as well as the massacre of which they were the victims during the Second World War as colonial subjects, African or African-American resistance fighters captured, mutilated, or murdered in a kind of pogrom. There are few researchers on this field at the outset, most of them coming from Europe or the United States, quite rarely from sub-Saharan Africa. How do we explain on the basis of our research the problem of Africans of all origins in Germany? The presence of Black men African descent in Germany is a result of various encounters, and this can be localized first by the end of the World War I, producing in Germany out of its former colonies a very special kind of Black immigration. This explains why, over the last few years, my research work focused on the presence of Africans and other Blacks in Germany from the 18th century through the end of the World War I to this day. It should be noted that my PhD dissertation, completed in 1980, investigated the image of Black men in German literature from 1870 to 1933. This image was shaped first by fears and various forms of rejection as response to the unknown according to colors and their meanings on religious spheres. These have then produced down centuries psychologically, racially motivated reaction long before German people had ever seen Black people who were denied first the fact of being or belonging to human being. In German language, from Middle Age to the 18th century, the Black man was associated to the devil. In German language, they call it der Schwarze, der Moor, der Neger, which successively, and in particular during the slavery and the colonization, means the one who needed to be educated to work. Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, has justified this point of view in some of his theoretical works. By the official end of slavery system in 1848, the Africans were involved in an era according to the new industrial age in which European development, just like America, had to take place. The same prejudice could consider the fact that the USA were part of the above-mentioned Berliner Congo Conference of 1884, which decided to conquer Africa after the end of the slavery, to pay more attention to the needs of exploitation of the human and natural resources of the African continent. It may be the first relation in three ways: Germany, USA, and Africa, through the economic needs of Europe and America, in which African in the middle of the interest stand. The identity of the Africans and Africa were therefore ideologically, economically, and psychologically targeted, not only denied as a subject making his own history, to quote the German philosopher Hegel, who wrote that Africa was enveloped in the deepest level of the night, not being capable to participate on the ongoing of the world. But he was also, because of that, and at the same time confined to an object of various kinds of discriminations. Africa was seen also in Germany as to be conquered. Also, this colonization was no longer as the others or a European colonial metropolis. Compared to other European colonial major power like France or Great Britain, Germany tried to appear as the best colonial power, and the Treaty of Versailles of 1918-1919 was presented as a treacher against Germany. This theme will survive the Weimar Republic and allow Hitler to conduct a very ambiguous policy towards African diaspora in Germany and use it as propaganda for his economic policy, especially towards South Africa. On one hand, the Hitler regime continued, because of its racial governance, to reinforce negative stereotypes of African and the African diaspora. For example, the only issues of there were to be confined to some stereotyped part of in Russian movies or in circus, and to some negative social roles. On the other hand, and conversely, this propaganda also sought to buttress his dream for colonial reconquest, like the promoting of a very special stereotyped kind of African arts in Germany, which reinforced the above-mentioned roles. For example, the German Africa show under the concept of good German colonization. In fact, it was one, on the long term, the ambiguous policy of Hitler, which could not be longer sustainable regarding to the context of the Nuremberg laws. It seems to me relevant to look at the legacy of the African image and its impact on the perception of Africans and African American life and culture in Germany, their struggle for rights and their relation to Germany in a very productive way of understanding the German history. That is somehow a way I see, for example, in the movie of Semben Ousmane, Camp de Charoy, 1988, the Charoy massacre was a mutiny by and mass killing of French West Africa troops by French forces on November 31, 1944. The tirailleurs involved were former prisoners of war who had been repatriated to West Africa and places in a holding camp awaiting discharge. And among other points, Semben shows a part with a Nazi helmet that is silent, proving his drama, stress and shock because he apparently was an inmate and a survivor of some concentration camp in Germany. He's very aware of the whole situation in which the tirailleurs were involved. Mostly, he's the one who shows how deep the whole enterprise is, which try to back up and erase the historical memory of African people in the various and tragic African European encounters. In the intercultural way of understanding the meaning of an engagement like Semben Ousmane did, we have to face those realities in a way that emphasizes the necessity of the only way mankind has to understand each other. In the same way, I would like to mention those Black people who belong to the Hall of Fame of African American culture and progressive thoughts, very involved in the struggle of their time, who deserve a very special place in the history of cross-cultural rich encounters, beginning with those of the 19th century, like W.E. Du Bois did mention it in his work. Du Bois had studied in Berlin. Or the work of the activist Marie Churchill Terrell, very involved in civil rights campaign and her relation to Germany through the International Congress of Women held in Berlin 1901. The only Black woman attending this conference, among others, also the Golden 20s in Berlin, including the remarkable figure of Josephine Baker, or the fate of a brilliant trumpet player, vocals, violin, piano leader and dancer, Valadia Snow, who despite her immense talent, had experimented the life in concentration camp in Denmark. Despite this late fate during this period, jazz is a real human contribution to the understanding of people from various cultural backgrounds, their contribution to the arts. This fact is relevant to our aims of explaining the history of the various encounters, Africa in general and Germany. However, it needs a real understanding to the real historical facts. So it is, for example, in studying the mentality history of the German people during the Olympic Games of 1936 and their appreciation of Blackness, which lighted up the nonsense of Aryan superiority and racial philosophy of Hitler and Joe-Louis Max Schelling, who become, despite their opposite system and involvement during the World War II, close friends through the art of boxing. For over 2 decades, the topic of Blackness in Germany has drawn increasingly some degrees of interest among scholars. It is another level of the presence of Africans in Germany. Since the initiative of the Black German 1986, a number of colloquia and symposia in Germany and Africa have addressed the issues, considering, for example, the realization, the struggle, the identity problem most so-called African Germans from African or African American descent face in Germany, and which led them to speak for themselves in poetry, novels, entertainment, and movie. Some published autobiographical pieces after visiting Africa, the land of their ancestors, or the US, in quest of their fathers, not knowing in which social, cultural, and racial situation comparable in somehow to their own in Germany they live. The results were not always satisfying. the socialization models were and still are a relevant factor in the search of own identity. It finds somehow a catharsis way of in writing like Hans-Jürgen Massaquoy's autobiography, Destined to Witness. Massaquoy describes his childhood and youth in Hamburg during the Nazi rise to power. His work provides a unique point of view as one of very few German-born mulattoes in all of Nazi Germany, shunned but not persecuted by the Nazis. This dichotomy remains a key theme throughout his whole life. Alike there are the same ways of escaping horrible social situations in performing arts, like the artist Joseph Nassy with his portraits of Black internees of concentration camps, trying by this way to escape, support, and testify the situation of inmates. The essence of this painting shows humanity, serenity, and beliefs in brotherhood between the inmate subjects of his art, and despite the horrible situation in a concentration camp. Poetry in the same way is also a kind of resisting. Also, some of the most gifted do not always find the salvation way in being denied, like the dramatically end in suicide of the late and wonderful Mai Ayim, whose work received the recognition and importance of the African Germans it deserved after she passed. Also in movies like the interesting one of Mo Asumang, Rus Germania, telling the initiative of the African German, which started when she first heard the song that called for her murder. This ballad is for you, from the neo-Nazi band White Aryan Rebels, quoting and discussing the migrants and racism theme. Participating to this trend of interest in the legacy and presence of Africans and people of various African descent, in producing a number of articles and presentations on the subject, including interviews with some of them, especially African survivors of concentration camps before they passed it, something I further continued discovering a large range of materials in the archives, like the trials held by the US after the World War II, the testimonies of Nazi prosecutors, the discovery of material covering a large and horrible time in which Black people, African and African American alike, were denied, rejected, mistreated, mutilated, and murdered in concentration camps. I had the opportunity to begin my research in the archives of Koblenz, Berlin, and Neuengamme, and my investigation established the importance of the African prisons in Germany during the 19th century. Also, during the traveling exhibitions, which showed Black, among others, so-called exotic subjects, which participate to certify a certain kind of absolute negative image of Black folks. We also read the proceeding and of parliamentarian debates from the Weimar Republic to the Third Reich and the Gestapo archives. I have visited the German archives in Koblenz and found interesting traces of the treatment of Black people and African during the occupying of the left bank of the Rhine in 1919, the racist and xenophobic campaign that this president aroused the racist campaign carried out by the Weimar Republic, Hitler, and the Third Reich. The sterilization of the so-called Rhineland bastards. We visited some concentration camps where were held prisoners of war of African descent who took part in the resistance movement in France, especially but also former African colonial subjects and African American prisoners of war murdered like already quoted in those camps. Some of them were subjected to medical experimentation. It seemed to me therefore relevant to find out the connection in eugenic researches applied to Jews and also Africans in the United States in Germany. This connection shows how deep the racism was in both countries among the scientists before the National Socialism. I found interesting materials regarding these aspects, and I tried in my research to find an objective link between, in one hand, and in Germany, the political, ideological, economical, and not least racial importance in comparing Jews and Blacks in the eugenic studies, the kind of medical experimentation which was done on Jews and Blacks in concentration camps and elsewhere, and on the other hand, the meaning of those experiences on Black and African American. It is interesting, in fact, to quote this coincidence in Germany before and after World War I, and in the USA at the same time. The victimization of Africans and African American, I mean the eugenic control of African American birth control, the medical experimentation on Black Americans, medical apartheid, like Harriet Washington called the Tuskegee syphilis experimentation in the USA, and the experience of the scientist and doctor of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity Teaching and Eugenics in Berlin, involved in carrying out research according to the racial aims of the Nazi state. Dr. Wolfgang Abel was one of the scientists who joined the Kaiser Wilhelm Society for Anthropology, breed research on French colonial soldiers like Professor Dr. Ottmar von Verschurer or Joseph Mengele, and Eugen Fischer preparing race expert report for the NSDAP, the Reich Kinship Office, which demanded that the group of the Rhineland bastard, group of mixed race children, not be allowed to propagate. There are some similar situations in trying to build a master race and at the same time in the USA and in Germany. Documents from Nazi war crimes show that Blacks, both African Americans, African soldiers from Africa serving in the armies of colonial powers, were singled out for mistreatment once they were captured by the Nazis and subject to medical experimentation too. There are also abundant similarities made between the persecuted Jews and the African, which were continually produced and highlighted in German society during the Holocaust. This research incorporates part of the fate of the Jews, the homosexual, gypsies, sick people, social outcasts, slaves, as well as Blacks or Negroes or colored people, because of different kind of rejection they all had to face. Another aspect.
Maggie, can I ask you to finish up, please? We're running out of time.
Yes, I just wanted to focus also the similarities in rejection, in persecution between Jews and Black people in Germany, because in my research I found some similarities in presenting both as well in poetry, in literature, as in philosophy, for example, Kant or Hegel. But I don't have time to focus and talk about this. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maggie. And perhaps we can talk about that in the discussion session now. Thanks to all the four speakers for very rich, very fascinating papers. I'm going to ask the speakers to turn their video back on. And we've got a lot of questions that have come in, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. We've got about 15 minutes before we have to take a break, and I will try to sort through some of the questions, and maybe I will start with Ismael. Ismael, are you there? If you're there, please. Ismael, est-ce que vous êtes là?
Oui.
Okay. Ismael, there was a question for you about the languages of the sources related to Jews in the Boucle du Niger, in the Niger Loop. Could you say something about the langage des sources?
Voilà, effectivement, les sources écrites que nous avons ont des supports linguistiques qui diffèrent dans le temps. Les premières sources historiques que nous avons, à partir du XVe siècle, sont des sources écrites en arabe, exclusivement, jusqu'au XIXe siècle. À partir du XIXe siècle, 1840-1841 jusqu'à 1893, les sources écrites sont écrites en arabe, mais nous avons des notes marginales en hébreu et des résumés en français. Ça, c'est à partir du XIXe siècle. À la fin du XIXe siècle, les sources sont exclusivement écrites et dans une période très brève parce que les Juifs seront exclus, seront exclusivement en français. Avant le 15e siècle, les sources sont des traditions orales sur les Juifs avant le 15e siècle, donc des Juifs noirs exclusivement.
Okay, thank you. I think I can translate at least some of that. The sources until into the 19th century were in Arabic, and then starting in the middle of the 19th century, around 1840, around 1840 to 1893, the sources are in Arabic, but with notes in Hebrew, and also resumes in French. And there was another part at the end, which I have to admit I missed. I don't know if somebody wants to jump in and help me with the earlier sources. But why don't we stop there for now? Thank you, merci Ismael. Let me move on for a moment to Janice's presentation. And Janice, there were some variety of questions, but I'll take one that came in from Jonathan Skolnick, and he's wondering about how Jewish refugee applications to get into West Africa relate to those to other parts of the British Empire. For example, British policy vis-a-vis Palestine. Are these discourses compartmentalized, or do they bear upon each other? And he's also wondering if the race discourses that you were discussing shaped the way that other non-white populations in the colonies viewed the Jewish Holocaust refugees.
Right, well, I'll try to answer the one about Jewish refugees writing into other British colonies, to say that there was an attempt to be uniform in this process. And so you get letters from the colonial secretary of the colonies to indicate that they are to kind of follow suit of what they've decided to, do in the UK on the metropole. So you have the Evian Conference in 1938 that is trying to sort out what to do with Jewish refugees. But essentially, and you have Malcolm MacDonald, who also is the person who wrote the Malcolm White paper to propose that British mandated Palestine become Israel. And he is a little bit more favorable to Jewish admission, in the sense that he sees if they're trained and very skilled, that they could be useful to the Allies if they can produce or work for the Allies to help them in the cause of war. So if they had professional and technical qualifications, he felt that that should allow them to come in, but not simply due to a need for a safe space. And you do see an uptick of them trying to get the Jewish refugees already in Germany, such as the Low brothers that I mentioned, to British Palestine. But a lot of times their travel papers were not up to date, and this caused a bit of a quandary to get them to South Africa or other parts of the British colonies, because Germany would not, and certain Nazi spaces would not update travel papers. They didn't want Jewish refugees traveling. And so then they had expired visas, and you couldn't travel with an expired visa, essentially. So you had this quandary of, we don't want Jewish refugees who are here because they can't go back home because of their papers, but we also don't want them in other British territories. So it's a bit of a mess for them. And then the other question was regarding, I'm trying to recall.
Perception of Jewish refugees on the part of other colonized subjects.
Yeah, I would say, just from what I was looking at, and my research largely focuses elsewhere, with this just kind of being a snippet as I look at a Black Jewish community. But there are Lebanese and Syrian populations, again, part of the British colony, but otherwise you have mostly intracontinental aliens. So foreign aliens from Mali or Burkina, etc. So you don't see many Asian populations at this time, which I know you mentioned Guyana for Latin America, and also Asian. So I can't speak to that per se.
Okay, thanks. Let me go on to a question for Edward. And I had a question myself, and it dovetails a bit with the question that's come in from Ben Ratskoff. So Edward, I hope you're there. Can you hear us? And maybe turn on your video. Hi there. Yes, thanks. So my question was a sort of general one, which is, could you say a little bit about what you think would be gained by the reintegration or the integration of Holocaust studies and Jewish studies into African curricula and research programs? And then Ben Ratskoff had a worry or wondered if you were worried that there's a risk in that integration of a kind of reimposition of Eurocentric white epistemology. So a little bit about the benefits and maybe the risks of the kind of integration that you're calling for.
Excellent, excellent question. I think the benefit is enrichment and expansion of both historiographies because they intersect. And one benefit will be to address the question that Janice was wrestling with in regards to how Jewish refugee experiences compare to Jewish refugee experiences in Kenya, for instance, and other places. Now, once we do that enrichment and expansion, once we integrate Holocaust and African studies, we will begin to realize that the indigenous Africans were just as anti-Semitic as the European colonial authorities. So that is very, very important. It's very important. I have a different access to records than the one that Janice showed, in the sense that whereas that particular document she showed indicated a paramount chief's interest in the cession of land for Jewish settlement, in the Legislative Assembly of the Gold Coast Colony, the chiefs were united in opposing the entry of Jews into the Gold Coast. Not only the chiefs, here indigenous responses, but the British colonial authorities, particularly the Director of Medical Services, had the same anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish sentiments that brewed in the colonial office in Whitehall. So here, the colonial authorities in the Gold Coast felt the Jewish people were communists who would come and upset the colonial balance, and then would make the obedient servant identity that the colonial state wanted to create complicated for the colonial state. So when we integrate African studies and Holocaust studies, we enrich African studies, and then we enrich Holocaust studies as well. Now, one way that we overcome any danger of descending into another Eurocentric prisms of African historiography is to take lessons from the 1950s, 1960s historiography that dealt with that Eurocentric components of African historiography, and then make the African studies and Holocaust studies issue better. One final point. How wonderful would it be if today's Africa, that has become the most homophobic continent on earth, understood what Mageia was talking about how homosexuals were treated by the Nazi state. The history of the Holocaust offers an essential entry point for alerting people in Africa to that danger. That is what I call a new moral Pan-Africanism. That integration allows that to happen.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you. Let me move on to a couple of questions for Maguey that came in from Jerome Vered and Jacob Agee. Maguey, I hope you're there. I can turn on your video and join us again. Yes, hi. So there's a question about whether there's any resonance in later German literature of the early German presence in Africa. And the reference is to the Prussian experience of Gross-Friedrichsburg in Ghana. So that's one question. And then another question would be about whether you see any specific elements in the African response to the Holocaust from the former German colonies in Africa, such as Togo, Tanzania, Rwanda, etc., Namibia, perhaps. I'm not sure if this is something you've been working on, but does that kind of specific entanglement with Germany have an impact on perceptions of the Holocaust?
Yes, thank you very much for the two questions. I want to begin with the second question. Everybody must understand the policy of Germany after the World War II, and especially after 1955, the time in which the German Republic, the West German Republic, was allowed to have some representation in Africa, beginning with the so-called cultural policy in Africa, la politique culturelle allemande. And the former colonies of Germany, Togo, Cameroon, were more involved in the presence of French or France rather than in Germany. So the exception was maybe Namibia for the historical encounter between Southwest Africa and Germany, and the genocide of the Haidara and the Nama 1906 and 1906. And because of that, until today, there is some kind of problem between Namibia and Germany. So it is very, very, very not comprehensive that the former French countries, French colonies in West Africa, like Togo or Cameroon, don't have any kind of researches or curricula regarding the period of the Holocaust and the fate of Africans in Germany. The only university, like Kisi says, I think, is Shah Anta Diop, with the historians and the Germanists, like me. We are very, very few researchers who get interested in trying to see in what kind of situation Black people or African were in Germany during the World War II. Like I said, maybe beside the movie of Ousmane Sembène with Kande Chara, or the next another movie of Sembène, Emitai, the resistance of the people in South Senegal against the Vichy regime and the relation between Vichy and de Gaulle and Senegal. This is the only exception in that kind of thing. I think that it is very, very, very astonishing that not many researchers take care about the history of the relation between Germany and Africa during the colonial period. We have some researchers who get interested in that, but most of the time, during the Holocaust and during the Third Reich, we have very, very, very few people who get interest of that. Like I said, beside Namibia, because of the history of the colonization and the massacres, the genocide of Nama and Haidara, in Cameroon, in Togo, you don't find anything about that matter. For the first question, I think that it is more a question of colonization before the Conference of Berlin, 1884, because Germany has, at the beginning, no interest in colonization. So it is very, very, very late that we can try to make some connection in the history of settling Germany in West Africa until the Berliner Conference. I don't know if I answered the question.
Okay.
My English is not very good.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. That was wonderful.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start the second session. Okay, so welcome back to the second session of our workshop, The Holocaust in West and Sub-Saharan African Studies. My name is Krista Hegberg, and I'm from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. For those of you who are just joining us now, we are taking questions and comments from the audience via the Q&A, and we will get to as many as possible following the presentations during the discussion period. The program will also be available for viewing on demand later on the Levy Center's website. We have 4 panelists this session, and I will introduce them all up front, and you'll also find their bios on the Levy Center website for more details. 3 of the panelists have been research fellows in the Mandel Center's Visiting Scholar Programs divisions. We're very pleased for this opportunity to share their work in this forum, and also for the opportunity to encourage other scholars working on similar topics to consider applying for our fellowship program as well. Our first speaker today will be Chigbo Arthur Anyaduba, who is an assistant professor of English at the University of Winnipeg. Arthur's work focuses on the cultural representations of genocidal mass atrocities in Africa, and he was recently a J.B. and Morris C. Shapiro Fellow at the Mandel Center conducting research for a project on genocides in Nigeria and Rwanda. Our second speaker will be Ruth Ginio from Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. Ruth is an associate professor in the Department of History and an expert on French colonialism in West Africa. She's the author of The French Army and Its African Soldiers, The Years of Decolonization, and French Colonialism Unmasked, The Vichy Years in French West Africa, as well as the co-editor of Shadows of War, A History of Silence in the 20th Century, and Violence and Nonviolence, African Perspectives. Our third speaker is Alioune Deme, an anthropologist and assistant professor in the Department of History at Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Senegal. His research focuses on Jews in Senegal during World War II, and he also spearheaded a coalition of embassies and international organizations in Senegal to establish the annual commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day there. Alioune has also been a Pearl Resnick postdoctoral fellow at the Mandel Center. Our fourth speaker will be Sidi Ndiaye, a political scientist who teaches at the New Sorbonne University in Paris. Sidi is the author of several books on politics in Mauritania and Northwest Africa. Most recently, Penser et écrire la société soninké aujourd'hui, Thinking and Writing Soninké Society Today. He's also the author of Tutsi du Rwanda et Juifs de Pologne, victimes de la même haine, Tutsis and in Rwanda and Jews in Poland, victims of the same hate, historical imaginaries and hate in the murder of neighbors, which he researched when he was the Judith B. and Burton P. Resnick postdoctoral fellow at the Mandel Center. So I will turn the floor over to Arthur for his presentation, Writing Post-Colonial African Genocides, the Holocaust and Fictional Representations of Genocide in Nigeria and Rwanda. Arthur, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. It's been quite illuminating being part of this workshop. So my work is organized around several questions about the discourses on genocide in post-colonial Africa. And I am interested in exploring some of the following set of questions. So how is it that in literature, film, and some other cultural media, the cultural memories of the Holocaust are often deployed as a trope for projects designed to represent and memorialize genocidal atrocities in some African contexts? You know, what are the implications of reliance on this trope for both the representational accounts and for our understanding of the events in themselves? And in my work, what I'm trying to do is to map the various intersections linking Holocaust memory to representations of genocide in post-colonial African contexts, specifically in this case, in Nigerian context and in Rwandan context. Even though my talk today, we focused exclusively on the Nigerian context of Biafra. And what I hope to use this kind of mapping to do is to propose that the Holocaust is an important point of reference for African and other artists attempting to make sense of exterminatory mass killings in Africa. I also want to propose that in ways both productive and distorting, the Nazi genocide of Jews has provided writers with the rhetorical and conceptual tools for articulating genocidal suffering in Africa, and the nexus of African traumatic memories and the Holocaust, for me, has seriously complicated representations of African genocides. So on the one hand, reference to the Holocaust provides those working on African genocides with a kind of descriptive toolbox centered on the language of suffering, whose utility has already been demonstrated and whose meanings are widely understood, if not always shared. And this toolbox has helped to make African mass atrocities visible and thinkable as genocides. On the other hand, however, the Holocaust has also in various ways overdetermined the explanatory and moral evaluative frames through which African mass atrocities have been conceived of and responded to in arts as well as in the real world. My interest in Nigeria and Rwanda for so many reasons, which I won't be going into details, but it's interesting that victim groups in these two contexts were groups racialized during colonial times as Jews in different ways. But specifically, both Nigeria and Rwanda are contexts within which literature of the kind I'm talking about and its criticisms mark certain violent experiences as worth imagining and writing about, and others as needing to be repressed. In the case of Nigeria, for example, the 1966 to 1967 massacres of Igbo people, or those designated as Easterners, have drawn very few imaginative and critical responses than the eventual war that lasted from 1967 to 1970. So the discourse on war in Nigeria appears to have overshadowed the discourse on genocide. And likewise, in the case of Rwanda, literary and critical responses to the Rwandan crisis have basically focused on the genocide of Tutsi people, but not often on the brutal civil war that began in that country around 1990 and which was being fought alongside the genocide that took place in 1994. So the basis of post-1994 Rwandan trauma, as explained in imaginative and critical writings about the country, has been linked to the deaths of targeted civilian populations and not to the suffering of the battlefield. And for me, some of the factors accounting for the repression of aspects of violent encounters during and after these kinds of mass atrocities result from political circumstances and commemorative practices, or a lack thereof, that have shaped how writers and artists have responded to atrocities in the two contexts. In the Nigerian context, the federal military government accused of perpetrating a genocide against the Igbo won the Biafran War and proceeded to establish a culture of genocide denial founded on a nationalist narrative involving the idea of a war being fought in defense of Nigerian unity. This nationalist narrative is perhaps one of the reasons that led some writers opposed to the government's position to evoke the Holocaust in their work in order to make comprehensible the idea that the Nigerian atrocities constituted a genocide. In the Rwandan case, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, won the war and cast itself as a heroic force that decisively ended a genocide. Since the war narrative also implicated it in violence, the RPF-led government privileged instead the memories of the 1994 genocide during the country's post-war reconstruction. So writings drawing comparisons between the Rwandan genocide and the Holocaust further served, at least implicitly, to represent the RPF's role as a moral one directed towards ending a genocide, and so repressed the idea that the RPF was itself a violent force engaged in political conflict and committing atrocities against the defeated Hutu government and its supporters. But I'll go into more specifics about cultural representations of the kind I'm talking about in the Nigerian context. So during the Biafra-Nigeria War in the late 1960s, an American-based Igbo poet, Jemie Onwuchekwa, compared the murder of Igbo people in Nigeria before and during the war to the Nazi German murder of Jews, writing in a poem he titled Requiem. Once in 53, 3 times in 66, Nigerians shoot civilians through the ears, rehearsing all known tortures, murdering all males and raping old women, forcing teenage girls in leper clinics, hundreds butchered, the 30,000 innocents, mild down Nazi fashion, a final solution that failed again. In these lines, Onwuchekwa catalogs a historical process of persecutions and systematic murders of Igbo civilians occurring before and after Nigeria's independence from Britain, which he considers to be similar to the Nazis' final solution. The lines, "a final solution that failed again," encapsulate the poet's defiant view that Biafra will survive the genocidal onslaught from Nigeria. The poet does not intend his funerary song in this poem to mourn the demise of Biafra. Rather, he intends it at the time as an oration to the murdered innocents whose deaths are propelling the emergence of a Biafra nation, similar to the state of Israel rising from the ashes of the Holocaust following World War II. But by the time Onwuchekwa's collection appeared in 1970, Biafra had been defeated and no African Israel resulted from the killing of Igbo people. Another example is Michael Echero, whose 1968 poetry collection made similar connections between Igbo and Jewish experiences of exterminatory violence. In his collection titled Mortality, Echero addresses the raging war in Nigeria by metaphorizing it as some kind of a creative process arising from catastrophe. In a poem, for example, titled The New Jerusalem, the poet describes the New Jerusalem of his imagination as the loitering memory of sweet birds in Eden. Like Onwuchekwa, Echero was living in the US at the time. He imagines himself as an exile in the US, charmed by recollections of songs from an idyllic African home, now encircled by chaos. In an explanatory note to this poem, Echero describes this New Jerusalem as a conjunction of African and Jew, linking the history of the Jewish state of Israel with modern African states, ostensibly Biafra in this case. Like the Jewish state of Israel, Echero sees these nations as being born from catastrophe. It is important to note here that in the late 1960s, during the Biafran War, the Holocaust had not yet become the paragonic symbol of genocidal suffering that it is today. However, following the Eichmann trial in Israel and the Auschwitz trials in Germany in the early 1960s, awareness of the genocide of Jewish people by Nazi Germany was spreading beyond the Western world. Such comparisons of suffering elsewhere to the Nazi genocide of Jews, as found in Biafra writing and its media reports, reveal the growing awareness of the Holocaust in African conflict zones at the time. The reference to Nazi German genocide of Jews in Onwuchekwa's and Echeru's poems are not coincidental. Several literary accounts on the atrocities in Nigeria during and after the crisis years compared the experience of Igbo people to that of Jewish victims of the Holocaust. In such literature, the comparison of Igbo suffering to the Holocaust offers the basis for writers to champion the international recognition of the violence against the Igbo as a genocide, and for recognizing the secessionist Biafra as a sovereign state necessitated, as in the case of Israel, in response to a genocide. Some other works that came after the defeat of Biafra were less forcefully nationalistic in their advocacy, but made references to the Holocaust to pass on a moral message on a supposedly universal condition of human cruelty. And to run through a few examples, you find these kinds of analogies in Chinua Achebe's, especially his poems at the time. A notable one is a poem in his collection of poems titled Vultures, where he compares the condition in Nigeria to a commandant at Belsen camp. Wole Soyinka was also very prominent in making these kinds of analogies in his works dealing with the crisis of Biafra. Recently, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's influential novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, made these kinds of analogies in very important ways. And it's not just in Biafra or in writings by Igbo artists that you find these kinds of analogies. During my stay at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, I discovered that a couple of Holocaust survivors interviewed in the 1980s and early 1990s, processed some of their experiences by making these kinds of comparisons, to Biafra in this case, right? So, for example, you have one by Cecily Klein-Pollack here, who says, look at those pictures and you know that they are not from Biafra. They are trying to say, what they are trying to say now, they are from our streets. You have another one from Ernest Glaser, who made similar kinds of connections. Eugene Burrough talks about the Biafran babies, and the kinds of malnourishment that was witnessed then, and says the children looked worse than the kids from Biafra, making comparison between starved, tortured Jewish children at the Nazi camps and Biafran babies, and so on. I think this one is very interesting. Susan Clare Hosa-Wester, who makes similar comparisons, drawing. These are some of the images that these survivors are actually making connections to. This last example here is actually referring to, this one, Tonya Blair, is referring to this iconic image that circulated in Western media at the time. Right. So in many of these, especially in Biafran writings, the comparison of Igbo or Biafran suffering to the Holocaust, should be understood for me as significantly decontextualizing, as well as dehistoricizing or depoliticizing the writer's message from its local setting, invariably transforming it into a moral message on a broadly construed human condition. And Lars Harten has made this point quite insightfully in his book, The Biafran War and Post-Colonial Humanitarianism. Harten focuses on Western media representations of the war to show how Biafran humanitarian advocacy and Western media reports of the war compared the suffering of Biafrans to that of Jewish people caught up in the Nazi genocide. Such comparisons of Biafra to the Holocaust, according to Harten, serve to make both events visible in distinct ways, while at the same time rendering aspects of both events invisible. While on the one hand, the Holocaust provided an analog conducive to comprehending Biafran suffering as a genocide, images of Biafran suffering provided Western audiences at the time with striking visuals of the suffering and anguish inflicted on Jewish people by the Nazis. Such comparisons, according to Harten, contributed to shaping the Nazi genocide of Jews into the Holocaust, in which the murder of European Jews ceased to be one entry on a long list of Nazi crimes, but became instead the historical and symbolical core of a new understanding of National Socialist rule and the Second World War. And this pattern of entanglement of Biafran and Holocaust memories that Harten has described is actually what Michael Rothberg has explained as a multidirectional process through which atrocity memories mutually shape one another. Rothberg has argued that the emergence of the Holocaust as an icon of suffering evolved through a process of cross-referencing Jewish suffering under the Nazis with suffering elsewhere, particularly during the period of decolonization. So through such entanglements or cross-referencing, the Holocaust facilitated the articulation of other histories of suffering at the same time as it developed into an icon of suffering able to shed light on events having little or nothing to do with it. So for Rothberg, the entanglement of Holocaust memories with other atrocities is possible because the public sphere of atrocity representation is a malleable discursive space in which groups do not simply articulate established positions, but actually come into being through their dialogical interactions with others. Yet, I will contend that more often than not, such multidirectional processes result in an oversimplification of understandings of conflict and consequently proposals offering easy solutions to complex and multifaceted problems. A major implication in this pattern of rhetorical comparison that uses, to quote Harten, the imagery of innocent victims as universalized icons of humanity is that it depoliticizes, decontextualizes, and oftentimes dehistoricizes our understanding of complex emergencies. So by subsequently comparing Biafran suffering to Jewish experience in cultural representations, both histories become deterritorialized and effectively reduced to a series of narrative acts focused on making atrocities public, and by so doing privileged a more narrowly moral humanitarianist agenda. Thank you. Let me stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Arthur. We will now turn the floor over to Ruth Genio and her presentation, Vichy in the Colonies, Anti-Jewish Persecution in French West Africa. Ruth, the floor is yours.
Hi. I just wanted to say first that I'm actually not a historian of Jewish history or Jews in French West Africa. Actually, I must admit that I always try to avoid this. I think that because I studied so much in high school about Jewish history, I always had a passion to study the history of other people. But sometimes your own history kind of catches you up. And while I was working on my PhD thesis quite a while ago, I stumbled on a box of documents regarding Jews in French West Africa. And I had no idea there were any Jews at all in French West Africa at the time. Since then, I think that Alioun, that is going to talk after me, has done much more in this area than me. And I continued with the history of Senegal and French West Africa. But what I'm going to present today is the result of the study the article that I wrote about the Jews in French West Africa. And my aim is to show that what we can learn from this case about the Vichy regime in general. Here is what we see here is a speech by the Marshal Pétain, and just following the signing of the armistice, in which he announces the conditions of the armistice to the French public. And I'm not going to read it all, but as you can see marked in red, in like 4 short paragraphs, you have 3 times mention of the colonies, of our colonies. And I think this symbolizes how much the colonies were important for the Vichy regime. This is one example of its importance. These are the propaganda. Vichy propaganda was very important, crucial actually. And the colonies were an important part in this propaganda. Here you can see this kind of quite racist poster, the Trois Couleurs, that's kind of represented by an Arab, a black person, and an Asian person that kind of symbolized the empire. This poster, the bulldog, is of course Churchill, and it actually recounts all the crimes of Britain against France. And when you see the crimes of aujourd'hui, of today, are all related to the colonies. This is a game for kids that shows the empire and its importance. And this one is the Trans-Saharan train. It's a project, very megalomaniac project that the Vichy regime actually started again. And you can see the mosque behind the mosque from French Sudan, from Mali today. Just a few words about French West Africa to those of you who are not familiar with its history. So it was established in 1895. It included all the colonies that are mentioned here. The governor general was in Dakar, and each colony has its own governor. There are a small number of citizens of French Africans who hold French citizenship in the 4 communes of Dakar, Gorée, Rufisque, and Saint-Louis. And the rest are considered colonial subjects, and they are subjected to forced labor and to the indigena, which is actually an apparatus that allows putting people in jail without trial. And of course, there's another federation, the neighboring Federation of French Equatorial Africa, which becomes very important in this story of World War II. So in World War II, between September 1939 and June 1940, around 100,000 soldiers are mobilized. Dakar is considered as a strategic port, so it's very important. The British tried to overtake the colonies of French West Africa in September 1940. After the defeat of France in June 1940, the French administrators have to choose between de Gaulle and Marshal Pétain. And the day of the armistice, the Governor General Pierre Besson, the Governor General of French Equatorial Africa, declares his support for Pétain, and he's transferred to Dakar, the more important federation. And at the same time, the governor of Chad, Félix Eboué, swears allegiance to de Gaulle, who appoints him as Governor General of French Equatorial Africa. This is Félix Eboué. As you can see, he's black. He's from French Guiana, and actually, his transfer to the Gaulle side creates this situation in which, if you can see in the map here, there are two Frances in the French Empire, in Sub-Saharan French Empire. French West Africa is under Vichy, and the French Equatorial Africa is under de Gaulle. Pierre Besson, just 2 words about him. He's actually this type of French administrator who is both anti-Gaullist and anti-British, but also anti-German. He was wounded in World War I and lost his leg, and he hated Germans and swore to save the colonies from German control. So several important facts about the Vichy regime in French West Africa. As I mentioned, it's actually there are two Frances. There is a Gaullist and British propaganda that originated in neighboring colonies, and that's a big headache for the Vichy regime. The fact that France is occupied by Germany is, of course, very embarrassing for colonial power. Also, there's it's very important to understand that the Germans do not control French West Africa at all. They have no influence there. There's one visit during the 3 years of the Vichy regime of a German official, but he uses a French name, so that the Africans wouldn't know that he's German. I'm not sure if that worked or not, but in any case, no German control. And this is very important for understanding the Jewish situation there. Okay, so the Jews in French West Africa. I just want to note that Professor Dem is going to talk after me, would probably have information about many more Jews that I present here. What I have here is a chart of the Jews that were already in French West Africa before the war started. So there are not refugees who arrived after the war started. And there, as you can see, the number is tiny. It's 110 people over the entire federation, and you can see here their origins. About a third of the men are, about a third of them are from a bit more than a third, half, I would say, is from France, and all the others from several other countries. If we talk about their professions, most of them were merchants, 4 worked in medicine-related professions, 2 were bankers, 1 was a lawyer. We'll speak more about one of the bankers and the lawyer. 1 was an accountant, and others engaged in trades related to agriculture, hotels, and industry. There are 2 anti-Jewish laws that are published in France. 3rd October 1940 is the first one. The second one is 2nd June 1941. I don't have time to speak much about these laws, but the main point was of the first one, and then also the second one was dismissing Jews from certain professions were supposed to influence public opinion. Of course, there are other elements like property, taking property of Jews, Aryanization. When these two laws actually were published, a bit later, they were also implemented in the colonies. In North Africa, there was the excuse was of implementing the law was that the Jews were there was a tension between the Jews and the Muslims, and it's important to limit Jewish influence, and also that there were many Jews in North Africa. All these excuses are, of course, in existence for French West Africa, because the number of Jews is really minuscule. There's no community structure, no leadership. They're dispersed all over the huge federation, and there are, of course, no tensions between 110 Jews and the African population. But nevertheless, both laws are implemented with some delay in both North Africa and French West Africa. And the justification for implementation in French West Africa, this is a citation of Boisson, the Governor General, and he says, on a first impression until now, it does not seem that the territories of French Africa are severely contaminated by Jewish interference. In fact, Jewish influence was, in our opinion, quite restrained. Even so, the future might hold unexpected surprises. So, it's like it's preventing the problem from occurring, and of course, we can see the anti-Semitic tones of this citation. So the major case of revoking or dismissing a Jewish administrator is that of Leon Geismar. The most senior Jewish administrator is a Secretary General of French West Africa. He is removed from his position for belonging to the Jewish race, and is compensated by another position, the Treasurer of Ivory Coast. And the reason for this compensation is that it is quite obvious that the higher-ranked officials in French West Africa are very much disturbed by the need to dismiss Geismar. They appreciate him, they even admire him, and they all say that he is not a Jew that should have been dismissed. But what can you say? What can you do? Well, we all know this kind of some of my best friends are Jewish, and they feel awkward about this, so they present him with the opportunity to become a treasurer of the Ivory Coast. This letter, I don't think I have time to get into it and to read all of it. Maybe you can go over it and understand it's very, very anti-Semitic attitude. This is a letter by settlers. There were not many settlers in French West Africa, actually a very small number, but these settlers wrote a letter to Boisson, and were upset by the fact that Geismar received a compensation for being dismissed. So this kind of reflects this attitude among the settlers, French settlers in French West Africa. I would like to move now to examples of two other Jewish employees that were not high-ranked at all, like Geismar, because Geismar, of course, had to, Boisson did not have much choice in dismissing Geismar. He was a Secretary General, it was obvious, but these two people, these two Jewish employees, were people who could be easily been ignored by Boisson. Probably the Vichy regime in France would never have heard of them. One of them is Sylvain Simon. He's an employee of the National Bank of Commerce and Industry in Ivory Coast. His boss, when Boisson sends a letter to his boss saying that he has to dismiss him, his boss explains that it's very difficult to find a replacement for him. It would take months for someone else to get from France. And also he's worried about Simon losing his lodging because he lives in an apartment that belongs to the bank. Boisson writes a letter to the Commissariat Général des Questions Juives in France to inquire if he can keep his job, but the answer is negative, and Boisson explains that he has to be dismissed. The other example is even more ridiculous. It's an apprentice of law in Guinea called Simon Chassid. And he lost his job because there was a limit of 2% limits of Jews allowed to work in legal professions. Now, in 1941, there were only 30 attorneys in the entire Federation of French West Africa, which also shows us the miserable situation of the justice system in the colonies. And 2%, and 1% out of 30, if we calculate, is more than 2%. So he had to be dismissed. Now, Besson understands that this is ridiculous, and he writes a letter again to the Commissariat Général des Questions Juives, and he says that, can I allow him to keep his job because it's ridiculous to fire one person for being over 2%. And the answer is no. The answer is the law is the law, and you have to fulfill it, and that's what Besson does. There were several attempts of Jewish employees to avoid dismissal. One was the claims of not being Jewish. For example, a person called Lucien Blanc, a police officer from Porto Novo in Benin, who stated that he was born Catholic and adopted by a Jew in 1929. Most of these claims were met with distrust and rejected. Sometimes another sort of claim of holding a subaltern position gained success. For example, one Jew who claimed to be working as a butcher from Guinea who specialized in pork, and those of you who know the Jewish customs can guess that this is something that might have been successful. So he can keep his job, but most of the Jews were actually dismissed from the employment. I just want to say one word about the abolishment of the anti-Jewish legislation, both in North Africa and West Africa. In North Africa, General Giraud, who takes over after the landing, the Allied landing in November 1942, he sends an identical letter to Noguès in North Africa and to Boisson. And he actually explains that the anti-Jewish legislation should not be abolished right away because it might cause political problems. And one of the excuses is that the congestion that might be created if all Jewish children returned immediately to school. And of course, for French West Africa, there were only 14 Jewish children in the entire federation. So it's really difficult to understand what kind of congestion was that. And the fact that the same letter was sent to both federations only show how unimportant this issue was for Giraud. The anti-Jewish legislation is abolished only after de Gaulle's victory in North Africa.
Excuse me, Ruth. I'm sorry to interrupt, Ruth. I just want to make sure we have enough time for. I see.
I'm sorry.
Yes, my apologies.
I'm not going to read all that. Just one word I want to say that these examples show how obsessed the Vichy regime was with the anti-Jewish legislation. And this is an example of how a case from West Africa can teach us a lot about the regime in general. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We turn next to Alioune Deme, who will deliver a presentation entitled The Fate of the Jews in Senegal. So Alioune, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research on Jews in Senegal. I will not, I think Edward did talk about it, Omar also, about the lack of really interest of activity when it comes to the history of Jews in Africa. And I think, people like me, like Edwards, like Professor Kassé, like Ruth. So we are really trying, to change the stuff. And why Holocaust in Africa? Why do we have to research on it? Why do we have to teach it? Well, it's Because the Nazi ideology wasn't just really Jewish towards Europe. So there were also African Jews and Jews who live in colonial Africa. And since Hitler hated all Jews, so it's interesting to see the relationship between the German colonial empire and their allies and Jews living in West Africa. So this is why I was interested in trying to understand the way Jews who were living in Senegal were treated by the Vichy regime. And I'm very glad so to make my presentation just after Ruth's presentation. So because there's really, it's kind of a continuum, which will make it really easier to present. First, I will do some historical background. So the Jewish presence in Senegal, Haidara did talk about the medieval era, so from the 9th to the 15th century, really the whole Bilad al-Sudan. But in Senegal, really it started during the 15th century, when with the Sephardic Jews leaving Europe to come to Africa. When they came to Senegal, they settled in 3 ports: Rufisque, Saly Portudal, and Joal. So that's really where the Jews settled first, starting the 15th century. And they had good relationship with African leaders. In fact, African leaders really protected the Jews against the Christian Portuguese who really were asking those African kings to kick them out of Senegal. So they say no, because we could not expel them because they did nothing against us. So, and one of the strategies used by the Portuguese was to say, okay, Jews were doing blasphemy against the Catholic faith, and that they continue to commit the religious imaginary really similar to idolatry. But the reason behind this whole antagonism was really economical. So the Christian Portuguese did not want a competition coming from Jews in the African soil. Okay, so I did talk about this thing. And the life of the Sephardic Jews in coastal Senegal was very vibrant. I mean, they had even like 2 synagogues, one in Saly Portudal and the other Joal. So they had really, and they had one famous rabbi, Jacob Pregrino, who excelled in Hebrew writings, in Hebrew rituals. And so again, they had a very, very good cultural dynamism in Senegal. Now, we don't know what happened between these Jews who came to Senegal starting the 15th century and the Jews who were in Senegal during the colonial era. So this is an area of interest that we'll know. So they still like this kind of lack of information. So between the medieval era to the modern era. For Jews in Senegal during World War II. So here I will focus on 3 situations. The first is Senegalese Jews who were in Senegal. Second, the Jews who were in the transit camp of Sébikotane. And the third is Senegalese Jews among the victims in Europe. So we have the 3 cases, and I will start with the first one. So Hitler and his allies did not only hate Jews in Europe, they hate also all Jews. So I did talk about it. And after the defeat of France, the Vichy regime implemented the 1940 and the 1941 anti-Jewish law. Ruth did talk about it. And those laws were applied in West Africa. And in West Africa, those laws were extended to cover forestry, to cover mining, to cover housing, and to cover business licenses. And the registration file, I think Ruth did talk about it, showed that there were Jews who were living in Senegal, so Tunisia, England, Germany, Hungary. And because of the anti-Jewish law, by 1942, they had to surrender their professional card. And Jews who were sent to Senegal by their companies, they needed prior authorization from the colonial administration, who first had to perform background checks. And very often, the colonial administration refused entry to the Jewish workers under the pretext that the work could be done by a French citizen. And Jews in Senegal were forced to register. The Governor General Boisson threatened those who did not want to register. And those who did register ended up losing their job. And Jews who violated the anti-Jewish law were punished either they had to pay 500 to 10,000 francs or 6 months to 2 years in jail. Or they have also 1 to 5 years in jail or 1,000 to 20,000 francs for false information or fraud. Now, so those were Jewish who were living in Senegal during colonization. But there was another category of Jews who came to Senegal when France lost the war against the Nazis. Data obtained from the colonial archives and from the testimony of the victims revealed that in Senegal, some Jews were taken by the colonial administration in one internment camp at Sébikotane for forced labor. From Sébikotane, some Jews were forcibly sent to work at the Office du Niger in Mali. And that Office du Niger was very notorious for the large number of Africans who died because of forced labor. And there is one camp in Mali called the Camp de Koulouko, which was so bad that even now it stays in the Senegalese imaginary. Even today, if you want to say somebody, I will have a harsh treatment against you, you say, I will send you to Koulouko. I will send you to Koulouko, which means I will send you, you're going to get a harsh treatment. And there's also something very, very interesting. Are we dealing with a transit camp or with a concentration camp? Because today we talk a lot about transit camp, but in the archives, the administration, the colonial administration was talking about concentration camp. And that camp was located at the school called École Normale William Ponty. William Ponty was created in 1903 as a school to train the first African elite and the first who ended up being really the first African leaders. Then the school was transferred to Gore in 1913 and then to Sébikotane from 1937 to 1965. And I said there was a lot of African leaders who were trained at Sébikotane. So you have the first president of Niger, Hamadi Diori, the first president of Ivory Coast, Houphouët-Boigny, the third president of Senegal, Abdoulaye Wade, and again, a former Prime Minister of Senegal, Mamadou Dia, and also the first president of Mali, Modibo Keïta. So it was really a school, again, based on the French colonial policy to try to civilize Africans by taking the first Africans to the French school to Frenchize their mind. And William Ponty was transferred to the French army starting July 2nd, 1940, to keep all German and Italian prisoners of war in civilian internees. It remained open until 1943, 1944. And what was the condition in the camp? So we have a lot of Europeans who came from the cold weather, who were taken to Sébikotane. Then, the first problem was really the tropical weather, hot and humid versus cold. Then they have a lot of insulation, some migraines, then some tropical diseases like yellow fever that really necessitated some vaccines, and the use of some medication like anti-dysentery tablets, like also Stovarci, which was really used against toxic infection against diarrhea. Also, there were also frequent outbreaks of stomach flu. And for this, Jews had to buy their own mask in the market at Rufisque, which is another city near Sebekotan. And there were also some other Europeans, Jews from Europe, that I call the unlucky ones. They were trying to flee Europe, but somehow they ended up in Dakar. So there were some also who were trying to flee Europe to go to the Americas. But to go from Europe to the Americas, they have to transit by Dakar for the refueling. And sometimes they were not always welcomed by the Boisson administration. In fact, some were taken to Sebekotan. And here we have two examples. The first, which is really interesting, was a Polish Jews who were trying to flee France to go to England, but somehow the ship ended up in Dakar, and he was taken to Sebekotan. After that, he ended up going to the United States. And during my internship at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, I have to thank here, I was using the US Shoah Foundation Institute Holocaust Survivor and Witness Testimonies. And I find his testimony there. And looking in the Senegalese archives, I found also his name. So he was really one case that we have both in the Senegalese archive and also his testimony, his oral testimony, talking about his experience at Sebekotan. So the second one is Mandel, who was a Jew from Austria. So during the end, he tried to flee during the Anschluss. And then he fled to Czechoslovakia, where he received harsh treatment. And from there, he fled to Italy, where, like other Germans, he was expelled. And then he fled to Albania, where his son was injured after the Italian invasion. And then he fled to France, where he was caught and asked to leave the country within 3 months. He took the ship to Chile, and in Dakar, he was caught and taken to Sebekotan. There was also some death. So this is really the new information that I'm getting from the archive because of the, so far, 11 deaths were reported. We have 3 Polish refugees, 5 Germans, and 3 British. And now the third situation are the Senegalese Jews, or Jews who were born in Senegal and who were among the victims in Europe, so in the concentration camps. And here, using also the archives, so we have some names and the name of the concentration camp where they died. And I don't have here only the name of Jews, but I have also the name of the Senegalese POWs. And this also shows really how sometimes Jewish history and Black history are tangled. Sometimes it's the same experience. And this is why this has to be told. In a sense, it's difficult to talk in certain situations Black history without the Jewish experience, or Jewish history without the Black experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arun. Our final speaker today will be Sidi Njae, who will be delivering a presentation entitled Exploring the Murder of Neighbors, a comparison of the genocide of Tutsis in Rwanda and Jews in Poland. And Sidi, the floor is yours.
Great. So as some of you know, my work dealt with the the place of historical imaginaries and imaginaries of hatred in the killings of a neighbor in Rwanda during the genocide of 1994 and in the Polish countryside during the World War II. I would like here to specify what I mean by imaginaries. By imaginaries, I mean a system of representation, symbols, and practices that allows social groups to define themselves and other groups. It's a deep-seated mode of understanding through which group imagine their culture. So in my research, I have examined at ground level two forms of massacre in order to compare the theoretical justification of extreme violence. In particular, when it is exercised by a group of individuals on close and known communities. I did not want it to address the issue of violence from the perspective of ideologies, as usually expected from a political scientist. I was mainly interested by its irrational dimension, what I call in my work the irrational rationalities of violence, les rationalités irrationnelles de la violence. So I would be very happy to discuss the methodological aspects in the discussion, but I would like here to point out what the main problem I had to face when I was working on this comparative research. The main problem for me has been to compare neighbors, Polish peasants and Jews, Tutsis and Hutus who were not, from the starting point, comparable. I could not compare these two categories. How to compare two situations in which the ways of living together before genocide, the logic of proximities were not the same. On one hand, it's clear that pre-war hostility toward Jews in the most cases was a sort of structural fact. Polish church and anti-Semitic newspapers sponsored by Price played a key role in the hardening of hatred and attitude against Jews. By contrast, in Rwanda, Tutsi and Hutus lived together. They shared the same tongue, they ate the same food with no food restriction, and mixed marriages were numerous. So two different situations, two quite different ways of sharing space and cohabiting. After a period of hesitation about the relevance of a comparison, I decided to approach the issue by adding another question. And this question was, how could two different social processes, two different cases, without equalizing them, have led to a massacre of neighbors by other neighbors? This was then the starting point of my research. A comparison of this phenomenon of ordinary men responsible for extraordinary acts in Rwanda and Poland rightly brings up at least two other issues. The first one is the context in which neighbors were murdered, and for Poland, the role of the Nazi occupiers in the brutalization and execution of Jewish neighbors by their fellow Polish citizens. As a matter of fact, we can observe that in Rwanda, genocide was a confrontation between killers and their Tutsi victims, which involved no third party. The killers' neighbors, supported by a murderous regime, acted alone against their Tutsi victims. In Poland, the equation was different. The Nazi occupier played a critical role in the destruction of the Jews, and this destruction involved in various forms Polish citizens. The German soldier mobilized them in different ways to carry out the crime. Although this aspect is important, I should point out that it has not caused me to radically readjust my reflection, because my work focuses only on murders voluntarily committed by neighbors. In fact, I believe that the occupiers' presence initially generated an atmosphere of social permissiveness, which made it possible to externalize and publicly assume anti-Jewish hatred, a hatred visible in the many programs preceding the war. This hatred, in turn, authorized, using the word of Jan Grabowski, an orgy of murder targeting the Jews. The second issue is why neighbors killed their Jewish and Tutsi neighbors. A pragmatic hypothesis explained the killers' behaviors in terms of material benefits, material interests of killing. neighbors killed because they were mainly interested by the good they thought Jews and Tutsis owned. I say yes, but I also explain that this pragmatic hypothesis, this material interest, was very much a result of the representation which have long associated Tutsi and Jewish with wealth and fortune. Among other reasons, it is because they always believed in the myth of Jewish gold and Tutsi cow that the killer's neighbors took life in the hopes of getting rich. We all know about the myth of Jewish gold. In Rwanda, we can find similar myth about the Tutsi cow. Before the genocide, possessing cow was portrayed as a symbol of fortune. Some Tutsi shepherd possesses cow like Hutus, but it would be clearly a mistake from this observation to generalize. Thus, even when the justification for murdering neighbors was supposedly based in reality, based in the material interest, it always overlapped with imaginaries. These were solid but not exclusive explanatory elements for the behaviors of ordinary men who became responsible for extraordinary acts. I would like now to give some concrete and brief elements of comparison which are related to different parts of my work. I will say some words about the words of death and brutalization of bodies, and I will finally evoke the way killers were involved in the massacre of their neighbors. The first point, I will not discuss the species of animalization or species that describe eventual victims are insects to be crushed. I will instead talk about what we call the rhetoric of vampirization or demonization. In Rwanda, the rhetoric of vampirization has been constantly mobilized both before and during the genocide. As in Poland, where Jews were treated as sorcerers who sucked the blood of Christian children, many people in Rwanda also considered the Tutsi as devils. Hence, to appease their instinct of cruelty, they had to kill Hutus, feed on their flesh and their bodies. I would like to quote here from the testimony of Elias Kalisa, a Rwandan Hutu extremist, evoking the phantasm on the figure of the Rwandan combatant of the Patriotic Army, who stopped the genocide at the end of June 1994. He says, before seeing them, Tutsi combatant, we were very scared. People told us to flee because they ate people. Some people believed, others not. But because of this frightening description, some began to watch their Tutsi neighbors differently, and the situation turned out badly. To many killer neighbors and extremists, the image of Tutsi was closely linked to vampires. I would like to tell an experience I had in Rwanda in 2014. I met an old woman in Rwanda for my interviews. We started the interview with my interpreter, and this old woman told me that her entire family has been killed by her neighbors. Then I asked her, how did she escape? How did she survive? She told me that neighbors who killed the family was discussing, and between them, they said they did not want to kill her because they were afraid of her because she was a sorcerer. By killing her, they thought she would come and haunt their lives. That is how she survives. As in Rwanda, accusation of witchcraft and legend of blood have pursued Jews in Poland before, during, and even after World War II. One can recall here the pogrom of Kielce in July 1946. Many books have dealt with this mytho-history. I will cite the work of Polish anthropologist Joanna Tokarska-Bakir. This work dealt broadly with the aspect of historical representation and anti-Jewish hatred. She evokes the testimony of several people in Sandomierz region and at the south of Warsaw. These testimonies talk about stories of Christian children found dead in different places of the region, And according to these testimonies, the Jews of Sandomierz was responsible of this murder because it was in their ways to abduct Christian children in order to do the matzo bread. They needed blood so to do so. According to this testimony, when a child was abducted by a Jew, he was placed alive in a cask with spikes inside, a cruel way to collect blood. According to these testimonies, collecting the blood of Christian children was also the only way for Jews to break the curse that had been thrown upon them by Christ. To crush the curse. So my point here is, if we want to explain the motives of killers in Rwanda, as in Poland, these irrational elements, also have to be taken seriously by researchers. My second point refers to brutalization of bodies and the weapon of death, weapon people use to kill their neighbors. My purpose is to try to briefly show what these elements tells us about the killer's representations. We know in Rwanda, we know thanks to many accounts and testimony that the killer neighbors almost systematically tortured and mutilated their victim before killing them, cutting the Achilles tendon, amputating hands or arms, impaling bodies, rape and genital mutilation of women. So many practices which definitely left the mark of hatred on the bodies of the dead and the escapees. The killer's attention to mutilating many parts of the Tutsi victims' bodies was in part linked to racist representation and imagery inherited from colonialism about the physical differences between Hutu, Twa, and Tutsi. For them, mutilating the bodies was portrayed as a way of wiping out, erasing these physical differences entirely manufactured by Western explorers, but also a means of revenge for the arrogance of Tutsi men and women. Neighbors in Poland use cruelty just as fully as the killer neighbors in Rwanda did. They have also loaded their acts with message of hatred for their victims. Many accounts collected or retold by researchers such as Anabi Kont, Barbara Engelking, or Alina Skibinska tells of these scenes of torture and mutilation which often preceded the murder of Jews in Polish countryside. The killers were not simply happy to execute the Jews or take them to their death. In most of the cases, they humiliated their victims with moral and physical torture. Smul Wasserstein, a witness of the Jedwabne pogrom, remembers, they were beating people to death, forcing them to sing and dance. In order to inflict suffering and harm, killer had also to use different tools, different torture techniques, and they had to show a certain shrewdness in the killings of their neighbors. An examination of physical injuries provided important information on the nature of the weapon used and the brutality of the perpetrators. Although the murders, the weapon were not entirely comparable in Poland and in Rwanda, in both cases, the killer's neighbors mostly used handcrafted weapons, or using the word of the German sociologist Wolfgang Sofsky, multipurpose objects of civil life. In Rwanda, machetes, billhooks, bludgeons, clubs, sticks, knives, lances, or the blunt or sharp object were used in the same way. In Poland, rakes, forks, sticks, knives, stone, and other blunt, sharp object also. To make massacring neighbors possible and effective, a certain murder's know-how was required. In Rwanda, as clearly shown, for instance, in forensics reports, the Haglund reports on massacre on Kibuye, where Tutsi victim took refuge, handcrafted weapon played a significant role in the massacre. In Poland, neighbors also use different tools. I will finish by that, Krista. In Poland, neighbors also use different tool weapons, such as knives, forks, axe, sticks, and clubs. As Barbara Engelking wrote, the crime were generally committed with the means available on farms, with everyday work tools, with objects that were close at hand. An account also quotes transcripts from the trial of Marian Rydewski, who took part in the pogrom of July 5, 1941 in Wachau. She explains, I went out in the yard, not hurrying. A witness who had been summoned on the night of the pogrom said, and I saw a Yid running away through the field next to our building. There were 3 men chasing him. There were other people chasing Jews. Koslowski had a bayonet, and the others had murder weapons, too, such as large stakes, shovels, and forks. I will not be able to go far, so if I have, Krista, can I have 5 minutes or no?
We have 15 minutes for discussion left.
Okay.
So
okay.
If you could wrap up, perhaps we could move on to the next stage. Thanks, Sidi.
Thank you. Sorry. So I would like to. So let me finish by that. Maybe in the discussion we will have to. I will have the chance to respond or to go further in my reflection. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry to cut you short. I know there's plenty to say and many questions. And as Sarah Stein said at the beginning, at the outset of our program, this is clearly the beginning of the conversation, certainly not the end. We have much more, many avenues to pursue. Let's see, we had a couple of questions for Ruth about the persecution of Jews in Senegal that were about the reasons for persecution and the sort of the method. Tal Bootman from OHSS asks about the grounds for persecution of the legal grounds, the Jewish butcher who was threatened, and of the 14 children who were expelled from schools. What was the sort of the legal rationale? And what is the legal grounds for these acts? And also from Jonathan Skolnick, who asked about the sort of...
Can't hear you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I didn't hear the last sentence you said.
I'm sorry. And then there's a second question, a related question. Sorry, from Jonathan Skolnick. They're both in the Q&A if you want to.
Yeah, I think I saw them. Yeah. Well, first I'd like to. Do you want me to take it now or?
Yeah, just maybe put two together with Jonathan's question about the intention behind the persecutions, whether there was a sort of forethought, and what the intention was were the Vichy persecutors, he asks, thinking or caring about what happens next to the people who were dismissed as Jews? Were they imagining that they would, quote, disappear? So perhaps if we take those two together, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I think that what I was trying to show here is that personally, Bosson was actually the one who executed all that. And he had the power to do anything he wanted. Well, not anything he wanted. Actually, he had, but he still asked all the time what he should do. I don't think he had a policy of his own, an anti-Jewish policy of his own. He didn't specifically, I suppose, like Jews, but he wasn't specifically against them. And really, I didn't think, you could see even from the quotation that I brought, although it sounded anti-Semitic, he did say that there was no Jewish problem in French West Africa. So for what I saw, he thought that all of this was redundant. And I don't, I have to emphasize that as I said at the beginning of my talk, I saw these documents by chance. They weren't my subjects at all. I worked on the Vichy regime in French West Africa, and I just knew that I had to write something about it when I saw these documents. But this is the only dossier that I've seen. So there might be, maybe Alyun can answer that, because probably he saw more than me, because this is his research now. From what I've seen, they didn't care what was going to happen next. When this boss of Sylvain Simon said, what is he going to do now? He won't have anywhere to live. He can't survive without his salary. Then the answer is sorry. I asked for permission not to do it. I was rejected. He had to go, and there was no further correspondence about also what happened to him, which also is interesting. But I have no idea. And about the children also. The children are mentioned. The fact that I'm not sure at all that they were expelled from schools. What I saw here is a letter that was actually written to Nogues in North Africa, where children were expelled from schools, and it was just a copy sent to Bosson. I said that it's ridiculous, because even if they were expelled from school, saying that that getting them back would be problematic was of course, not logical at all. But it doesn't necessarily say that they were expelled, because the letter was just a copy of the North African letter. Okay.
Thank you. There was a question for Arthur from Sarah Castile at Carleton University. And Sarah writes, I was struck by the divergence between Edward Kissie's comments on the lack of interest in the Holocaust in the independence era and your identification of persistent patterns of comparison in literary discourse. I'm curious how you account for this difference. Would you differentiate between the place of the Holocaust in West African literary artistic discourse versus journalistic or other discourses? So Arthur.
Thanks for the question, Sarah, and for your observation of a kind of divergence between my work and Edward's. I think that perhaps one distinction between the place of the Holocaust in West African literary discourse versus the journalistic and other discourses might be in considering journalistic accounts as more oriented to making atrocities public at the time of conflict, right? So whereas literary works could work in this way, but more often than not, they come many years after atrocity events. So in my work, I find that analogies of Jewish and African experiences in literary works, say in the case of Nigeria and in Rwanda, actually continued much longer after the crisis. And that suggests to me that besides the journalistic impulse to publicize atrocity for, say, humanitarian and other forms of interventions at the time of conflict, there's some other kind of cultural and political implications for such analogies, in the way that they continue. And one is, for me, in the construction of what Caroline Dean describes as the moral witness. How we've come to build our ethics or ethical consciousness for different kinds of interventions around the idea of witnessing, for moral imperatives or for moral purposes towards, especially witnessing by making connections to experiences of atrocities in ways that suggest that they're genocidal in nature. So that's one way for me to think about that. But thanks for this question.
Thank you. We had a question from Jordana Leibowitz for CD about the extent of the comparative dimension in his work. She says, your comparison is fascinating. I'm wondering if you included the gas chambers, the camps, and the more industrial killing of the Holocaust in your analysis, or if that was beyond the scope because it's not neighbors killing neighbors. Do you have any thoughts on the industrial style of the Holocaust in comparison to the genocide in Rwanda?
Very good question. Very good question. The thing is, the main difference between Rwanda and Poland and the Holocaust, in Rwanda, we have a genocide of neighbors, what we call a genocide of neighbors, realized by neighbors. And I could not compare the industrial dimension of the Holocaust with what happened in Rwanda. Rwanda, you have people who killed their fellow neighbors. In Poland and in Europe, we have the industrial dimension, the destruction, the gas chambers, and the industrial dimension of the genocide was not comparable to what happened in Rwanda. So I wanted to be cautious and not to compare. I just wanted to compare what was comparable. And after reading the book of Les Voisins de Yad Vavne, I can't recall his name.
Gross.
Yeah, Jan Gross, yes. That told me give me the idea to extend the comparison. I wanted to work first on Rwanda, and then after reading this book on the advice of my former supervisor, Jean-Charles Chourek, I knew that something has to be done in terms of comparison. So yes.
Thank you very much. Perhaps one, since we're close to time, one final question for the entire panel, for whomever would like to take it up. I'd like to pick up on a question posed in the last panel about the challenges and the gains of integrating Holocaust studies and African studies with a related question. Holocaust studies, of course, is quite dominated by Europeanists, myself included. And I'm wondering what sorts of blind spots you have encountered when bringing your work into conversation with scholars focused on Europe, and what sort of work do we need to do in the service of integrating Holocaust studies? And that's an open question for whomever would like to take it up. Perhaps Alioune has some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. First, I'm sorry I did not put my last slide. I have to do it if you allow me, Krista.
By all means.
We'll just say thanks. So I have to thank the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for the fellowship in 2013 and 2014. I really forgot about it. It was the last slide, so I really had to mention it because it was really important to me. So I have to really to mention it. Now to come to your question, I think we have to take into consideration something. French West Africa. Our history was colonized until 1960. So 1960, with the independence, Africans decide to write their own history. From prehistory to the modern era. So I think the focus has been really on the big empire, the African heroes, stuff like that. So sometimes I say, well, let's forget. Even in terms of diasporan studies, Black studies, we don't do a lot here in Africa. We've been focusing really African, the continent of Africa, about our history. So to come to respond to your question, yeah, I mean, talking to some other colleagues, yeah, I mean, they have their own area of interest. Sometimes you find people who are really open-minded in terms of broad comparative perspective, so trying to see really how it happened. But again, like I say, we have also, we can learn something like from Europe, a lot of research in Europe, a lot of outreach in Europe, but still anti-Semitism is prevalent in Europe. So maybe having some other experiences might help to see, you know, how we can have some comparison, try to see how we can solve that issue. And in terms of broad comparative, again, like I say, Holocaust is not just Europe, it's everywhere. So slowly, maybe people will be open to the idea of trying to see what happened in other continents.
I certainly hope so. And anybody else want to weigh in?
I can join. I can. Okay.
Yeah.
So for me, I think the question based, of course, I work on cultural representations much more. And there's a question that actually Mbembe raised in one of his works of the early 2000s about why the immensity and the enormity of African suffering and trauma had been unable to produce some form of powerful universalized vocabulary for us to understand not just African sufferings, but sufferings elsewhere. And I think that question is very profound, given the history of slavery and colonization in the African continent. And that's why, for me, it's very possible for one to argue that attempts to reproduce Holocaust memory in African cultural representations could be doing something negative, right? And to some extent, in some of the works I have been exploring, it seems that these attempts may be highlighting the workings of a very largely Western culture industry that lies behind and is perhaps responsible for the production of these kinds of works. Works that, or a culture industry that is intent on exploiting the cultural significance of Holocaust memory so as to publicize or sell African genocides to Western audiences, right? And my point is that though in these kinds of works, writers, consciously may intend to inscribe the Holocaust with all the best of intentions and aims. However, the works in which they do these kinds of analogies usually end up obscuring rather than illuminating the peculiar historical and political circumstances that precipitated exterminatory forms of violence in African context. I think that's one way I'm thinking about this kind of question. So it's a very good question. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we're about at the end. If anybody else would like to, in our last minute or so.
Can I add something?
Yes, Edward, please.
Okay. I think Krista, the question you asked about integration and its contradictions is very central to a new emerging construct in Holocaust studies called decolonizing the study of the Holocaust. I think in terms of the blind spot, the challenge is the challenge of language. We have to be very careful that in the study of a sensitive subject, such as the Holocaust, with a kind of emotional and moral investment that the survivors of the Holocaust have, using language like Africanizing the Holocaust, decolonizing the Holocaust, would represent the kind of blind spots that might get us into trouble. But it is also the kind of language that we have to wrestle with. Perhaps one way of doing it, in terms of overcoming the challenge of language as a blind spot in the integrational and intersectional process, is using words like enriching the study of the Holocaust or expanding the study of the Holocaust. The benefits, let me give you one. Let me give all of us one.
A quick one, please.
Yes, a quick one. How did Jewish refugees deal with the trauma of the Holocaust in their life of exile in Sub-Saharan Africa? That is a very, very rich area of investigation. And that is what integration can illuminate.
Thank you, Edward, for sharing your thoughts, and thank you to the panel. Obviously, we appreciate your sharing your perspectives and your research, and then we have opened up many more questions, I think, than we have answered, which is always the goal of any good workshop. To close, I'd like to thank Ruth, Alioune, Arthur, and Sidi for the panel, all of the participants for sharing your work and helping us push forward and expand and complicate the history of the Holocaust, the field of Holocaust studies and Jewish studies and African studies. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. And thank you on behalf of the Mandel Center to the Levy Center for co-organizing this program with us, to Omar Boom and Sarah Stein, Vivian Holenbeck and Michael Rothberg for their support. I also want to be sure to thank our colleagues behind the scenes, Chelsea White and David Wu at the Levy Center and Noel Little at the Mandel Center, without whom none of this would be possible. A huge thanks on behalf of all of us to you. And finally, thank you to our audience for your engagement, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with you in the future. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Krista.
Thanks, Omar. Anything last you'd like to add?
Thank you, Krista. Thanks for all your work. You have been an amazing partner in this. And also, I would like to thank everyone, to all the scholars, these amazing scholars who've been part of this conversation. We learned so much, and we look forward to having future meetings to have more conversations in person and virtually. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much.